apologetic work to do now. Latter-day Lion, where are you? We need some help from you now. Come on, latter-day apologists, we need some help from you now. Come on, latter-day Lion, I see you know when you got a critic's liver. But those critics ain't fooling us, 'cause we can see the way they shake and shiver. You know we got a criticism to solve. So latter-day Lion, be ready for debate, now don't hold back. Oh, the critics are creeping in the dead of night, twisting words like shadows in the pale moonlight. But we're the pride that roars, with truth in our claws, defending the faith, breaking all their false laws. Latter-day Lion, hear the call, chase away the doubts, make them stumble and fall. From Book of Mormon mysteries to Temple Veil rips, we're apologizing hard with scholarly flips. We're sniffing out the sophistry, tracking logical traps, those anti-Mormon spooks in the rusty old maps. With scriptures as our snacks and prayer as our Zoom, we'll unmask the fallacies in the conference room. Latter-day Lion, you're our fearless hound. Bark back at the bloggers, turn their theories around. From Nauvoo nights to pioneer wagon trails, we're solving the riddles, leaving no holy grails. Darkness is rising, the critics are howling loud, but in the glow of the gospel we stand unbowed. Feel the Spirit's thunder, the evidence gleams, no undead doctrines, just eternal dreams. Final. Latter-day Lion, where are you? We're coming for you. Apologetic work, yeah, we're breaking through now. Latter-day Lion, roaring true. Oh, true. The truth will astound. Critics shiver and shake, and the gospel's profound. Come on, apologists, let's debate till dawn. Unravel the mysteries from dusk until dawn. And as the veil thins and the shadows retreat, the latter-day Lion emerges from the mist of antiquity. No mere mortal defender, but a beast of burning testimony, claws sharpened on the whetstone of witness. Beware, ye detractors of the divine. For in the hush of revelation, his roar echoes eternal. The critics may prowl, but the pride prevails, and the night is just beginning. Latter-day Lion, where are you? We got some apologetic work to do now. Latter-day Lion, where are you? We need some help from you now. Come on, latter-day apologists, we need some help from you now. Come on, latter-day Lion, I see you know when you got a critic's liver. But those critics ain't fooling us, 'cause we can see the way they shake and shiver. You know we got a criticism to solve. So latter-day Lion, be ready for debate, now don't hold back. Oh, the critics are creeping in the dead of night, twisting words like shadows in the pale moonlight. But we're the pride that roars.
All right, welcome everybody. We have a wonderful discussion planned for you tonight. I'm your host, Timothy Berman, for Mindful Latter-day Saint Christian Living and Apologetics. I also do Sacred Sobriety Path for the Soul on my other channel. And I have Jessica from Christ Pearls here, and hopefully we'll have other people joining in as time allows. And so, yeah, we are going to be having a conversation about defense of faith. And we're going to address anti Mormonism and toxic apologetics, because I think this is something that is a good discussion to have. How do we approach apologetics? How do we engage in conversations, especially when there is a persistent weaponization of social media when it comes to apologetics and how we respond and how we interact with people who are critical of our faith? And so let's go ahead and just get the ball rolling here. What are your initial thoughts? What were you hoping to see where this conversation is going to direct us? And we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that you made a lot of good points, Tim. I was reading through a lot of your remarks before we jumped on here, and I have to say, like, we've had this conversation before. I'm not really one for apologetics. So I feel like I'm kind of aloof when it comes to it because for me, it's really like I don't think of myself as an apologist. I don't think of myself as somebody who's doing apologetics, but I do think of myself as somebody who has a testimony and wants to defend the faith. And that's sort of, I think, like a driver for me in my life. It always has been. And so I think this is an important discussion because I feel like, especially in recent years, and maybe it's because of social media, I feel like there's a need for, I don't know, I guess apologetics for defending the faith online. It seems like for a long time, and maybe you remember this, but it seems like from like the early 2000s until maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, like anti-Mormon content dominated social media. It just was everywhere. You couldn't really find a lot of faith building content. There's a lot more now. Like I think that it's a growing arena for us, but I felt like for a long time there was really nothing. What about you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember the days of when the internet first came out, and you had your discussion forums, you had your chats, and I mean, the internet when it started getting going was fertile ground where all of a sudden you have people having conversations. Normally, uh, when you have people who were challenging Latter Day Saint Christian beliefs. Usually it was done community, local level. So you were invited to like a seminar or a workshop at the local church down the street, and or there was somebody that somebody knew who had left the church, and now their whole ministry and evangelism was about converting Latter Day Saints out of the faith and the into whatever Christian denomination there is. And then you have so the internet, the history of this, so kind of give some backstory here. The history for the counter cult movement actually has its start back in the late 1970s. John Ankerberg show, Dr. Walter Martin. Well, I don't refer to him as a doctor because he does not legitimately hold a doctorate degree. And so Walter Martin, founder of Christian Research Institute, that was taken over by Hank Hanegraaff, Bible Answer Man, and then you have Gerald and Sandra Tanner's, their Utah Lighthouse Ministry. You have Ed Decker with the God Makers and Saints Alive, and then Mormons for Jesus, and all of those old school counter cult and anti Mormon ministries, all books written, Mormonism research ministries. And so you have all these books that are written, and nobody really had access to that type of information. So they were going unchallenged, uncontested. So unless you had the ability to get to Salt Lake City and access the wealth of information like the Tanners did, you really didn't have much to go on to defend your faith. And then the internet comes along, and then you have the chat rooms, Yahoo Chat, MSN Chat, all those old school chat rooms and everything. In fact, that's how uh, faithful answers, informed responses um, got started, was because of the constant criticism that they were coming against in the chat rooms. And so they started pulling together, creating a website, and so the internet became fertile ground of, we were for the longest time playing catch up to a lot of the criticisms that have already been well established. And then you get in the scholarly research. So you have farms, you have um, that's now the Maxwell Institute. So the BYU religious studies. And so you have all this Latter-day Saint scholarship. We are no longer playing catch up in the digital age. I think we have been positioned to where we now are surpassing it. And so now a lot of our critics are the ones that are now playing catch up, because they're still relying on those old tropes, those old arguments, those old criticisms. And we see that time and time again. But with the advancement of social media, there seems to be this revival of toxicity within, and it's on both sides. It's not just one side, it's on both sides. I've engaged in it myself. I've seen a lot of people engage in it, and you get caught up in it. You really do get caught up in it. And so this is why I think it's important to address it. So how do we walk away and respond appropriately in social media conversations, and shut down the arguments of the critics, but yet still also be a peacemaker while we are still contending for the faith, and not allowing the criticisms to go unresponded, or what was it that Monty used? Uncontested. So we do want to contend, we do want to address it, but how do we do that? And that's why we're having this conversation tonight. And the importance of having this conversation. This is an ongoing conversation. It's not a one and done deal. So it's an ongoing conversation that we need to revisit on a consistent basis. And so with that, the very first thing is, what does it mean to defend our faith? How do we engage in apologetics where we're not actually attempting to win arguments? Because I know for me, hindsight being 2020, had I known what I know now, I did go in with the idea of, I need to win the argument. I need to prove that we are Christians, that we are what we proclaim to be. But over the years, I've learned that apologetics is not about winning arguments. It's about defending our faith with scripture, prayer, and respectful dialogue. And this is contrasted with how the counter cult ministries attempt to do it, and showing how defense can be rooted in compassion rather than judgment and condemnation. And so that's the beginning point of the conversation right there.
Yeah. I think it's a fine line. I mean, I have a hard time not like reacting emotionally. You could say it's because I'm a girl. It really does depend on the day, the week, what's happening, personally. I get kind of irritated, and I think this can be a problem. And I think it's one of the reasons that I don't really particularly like doing apologetics. I do think that there's times though where, to your point, you can't let something go uncontested. And so then I find myself, I think, having this like inner conversation, like where it's like, okay, can I respond to this in a way where I can contest it without creating contention? Like, these are
Right.
real questions that I'm sure a lot of people have. I think even like your average Latter-day Saint who's just active on social media can get sucked into so many different debates or contestations of
Mhm.
what we believe with people who have their own personal agenda and beliefs, and so probably everyone on some level is going to, I don't know, maybe have this debate in their mind, like, when do I respond? How do I respond? Is there a way I can do it like peacefully without creating more contention? Is there a way I can
Right.
do it with strength? I think there is like a quote that I want to try to find, and I don't know, maybe you can kind of respond back at me on this one, but Do you remember when Elder Holland, it was, I think back in 2021, when he gave that speech at BYU? It was just your like typical devotional speech, if I remember right. And there was like a lot of faculty there. And he was talking about um like addressing, you know, the defense of the family. Like he was saying specifically
Mhm.
to defend the faith and the family. And he had quoted an old metaphor that had been used. I think originally it was Neil A. Maxwell who did the musket fire analogy. Do you remember that one? So he used that
I
musket
don't.
fire metaphor. I'm going to see if I can find it. I'll see if I can find it. But basically, he was calling on BYU faculty to set aside their desires for accolades and, getting, he was basically saying, even if we as BYU, an institution, have to take ourselves out of the world accolades and the world credentials, um, then so be it. Because we have a specific purpose in this education that we're doing. We're not trying to be like the world. We're trying to educate people in a way that merges education and academia, like world knowledge, with our religious knowledge, and that we
Right.
shouldn't be setting that aside. And I appreciated the way that he gave those remarks, although he made a lot of headlines that were not um, very positive. A lot of people were angry with him, even in the church. People were very upset, and I don't know, it made me think a little bit harder about what's the best way to, um, I don't know, do the musket fire thing. Yes, musket in one hand and a towel in the other, defend the doctrine and build the kingdom. Yes, that quote. It was really good, and that whole BYU speech was really good. I actually listened to it a few times because I found it to be really inspirational and refreshing. I love those kinds of like more harder kind of fiery sermons. I don't know why, but they just kind of invigorate my spirit a little bit. And that was one where he was not like mincing words very much. Like he tried to deliver, I think, what was a nice message, but he was being really bold about the fact that we do need to defend our faith and that we're not going to be able to align with other religions and other worldviews as much as we wish we could because we're
Right.
different.
Right. And I guess that really gets into really the key issue is how social media has been weaponized and how it seems to amplify the term toxic apologetics. And what I mean by toxic apologetics is that it's very hostile, it's very vitriolic, it's very condescending, condemning, judgmental. Now, there's a difference between just calling somebody out for, when their attitude and behavior is on display, and it's very observable, and you are engaging in conversations with them. And I do this time and time again. And you said, you're flat out lying. You're flat out being deceptive. That's not being toxic. That's actually speaking truth. That is calling it out for what it is, their attitude and behavior. Now, critics don't like that. But what becomes toxic is that you are the best example that I could think of is you mentioned the accolades, is that a lot of times it doesn't really happen much now. I don't see it, but I do see it every once in a while. But it used to be that when somebody comes after you, you're engaging conversations, you're on Facebook, because Facebook used to be the main social media hub before Twitter, before Reddit, before all of these others, TikTok and all these others, Facebook and message forums and chats. Um, you would have people say, "Well, I used to be a member of the church. I was a gospel doctrines teacher. I held this call," and so they start giving their credentials, their litness of things that as if it's like they're propping themselves up, saying, "I know more than you," and I see that. Uh, and let me give you an example of what I'm talking about for toxic apologetics, because as I'm talking about this, um, let me bring that. As I'm looking that up, what are your thoughts on how social media has been weaponized to attack our faith and people coming after us for what we believe.
Well, I can't say that I'm surprised because these are the last days and we're living in them. And it just seems like a natural progression of what has always existed. And to your point, it used to be like one way pamphlets, people picketing up over there at Temple Square, which they still do, and they hold up their signs and they try to cause contention. And those ways are still employed to this very day. There's still bad articles written about us. There's, like that Wall Street Journal article that we just saw recently. There was also like a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, it was in uh, National Geographic, I think it was it? Or maybe it was one of the history ones. But they did an article on Joseph Smith. It was totally skewed. They were featuring a book by a guy who really knows nothing about our church. And it just, things like that, they've been going on for a long, long time and pretty much since the start of the Restoration. And so I think that as soon as we got the internet, it's no surprise that that tool would also be one that the adversary would use. I mean, we've recently been counseled by David A. Bednar twice now about AI and technology and social media and how it will be a weapon. And not only is it a weapon, but it's actually a tool of the adversary to tempt us, to keep us from doing the things that we really should be doing and being engaged in. It can become something that acts upon us rather than us acting upon it. And all of those things, I think, are just natural progressions of an apparently ancient battle.
Right. So this is a blog. It's on Blogger. It's the Anti-Mormon blog, the Anti-Mormon by this gentleman, Glenn. I've interacted with him. But you, you go through and you read this comment section here, and he basically shows his arrogance, his spite, and he shows his and I'm trying to find it here. Um so yeah, because somebody posted there, I don't appreciate Itar talking down. So somebody's calling him out for what he's doing, and then he says, I just post Mr. Anonymous comment to show you what I put up with. I have never been rude nor condescending in my response. And certainly, but right before that, it says, "You're through here. It isn't rude or condescending to refuse to help people find false teachers. Mormons are not Christians, and there is nothing wrong with saying that." And then earlier, he basically just prides himself on his understanding and knowledge. And we see that we did another episode on previous episode with Bill Young. You go and read his comment sections on that response that we did, and he basically says, has the same arrogance, same attitude. And so when we talk about how social media amplifies criticisms, it's often through ex-Mormon influencers. Right now, the biggest ones that we see is Alyssa Grenfeld, and John DeLynn. And so there's this, and then you have all these evangelical counter cult voices and internal dissenters. And where it becomes toxic is that it begins to thrive on mockery, distortion, and emotional manipulation, where it erodes a person's testimony. And I know I've seen it, I've experienced it. I don't, and we actually had a prime example the other night when we were on Sam's deal on Sam's channel Through the Mist, where uh we had a person come into in the live chat and was really just being, I don't know, I
Well,
can't.
they were making a lot of personal attacks and actually, like,
Right,
specifically towards me, and it really ticked me off, and I have to admit, like, I am not the person who's just gonna be like, "Oh, yeah, I'm fine with this, like, just keep letting them be there," and I'm the kind of person who was like, "This person shouldn't be in this discussion, like, they should not
right,
be here," and the reason why is because they were saying really mean, nasty things, and it
right,
wasn't just about our faith, it was about, like, me specifically, And then also like about our faith. And that like I got super pissed. I was just like bad comments, bad attitude. This type of person shouldn't even be in here. It's like, I don't know, to me, that's not somebody who is going to help the conversation. And when they bring in
Right.
that kind of like evil spirit, it affects everyone. It definitely affected me.
Right. Right. And one of the things I've noticed, there's two ways that I've seen this happen in our online discussions when we're trying to respond to criticisms, or we're just simply trying to just share messages, because sometimes, especially now with TikTok, and we go up on somebody's live and we're having a discussion, somebody comes up and they just want to throw a monkey wrench into the whole conversation and derail that and want to argue and debate. And there's two things that I've seen, and it still happens, is they'll come into a conversation, or they'll post something that says, I'm curious about what you guys believe. They'll say, I'm looking into the Mormon faith, I'm curious. And you start they seem to be sincere, they seem to be genuine. And then when the conversation unfolds, it's a way that they pull this bait and switch, that they come in with genuine authenticity, and I call it mock authenticity. I call it mock genuineness, where they're attempting to put on this facade that they're genuinely interested in what you have to say, but the end game for them is to undermine and to evangelize and to condemn and to mock and challenge you. And and sometimes it's difficult to discern, because you don't want to just discount every single person that really does have a genuine question, but you also have to be on your guard, because you're waiting for that next foot. You're waiting for them to pull the mask away so you can reveal themselves for who they truly are. And so one of the most common things that I've seen recently over the last couple of years is this idea that when you do step getting into these conversations online, and you start having discussions with people in social medias and responding to them, the quickest thing that they throw out is gaslighting. So our critics will say, well, you're gaslighting me. And I push back on that, because they just heard that term, but I don't think they really understand the full breadth and nature of what gaslighting is. And so not only are we not only has social
Well, they
media
don't
been
really seem to
weaponized.
understand the full nature of the Bible and the things that they claim to believe and the practices that they claim
Right.
to employ either, because I
Right.
can't even I mean, we've had this conversation so many times, so should we be surprised that they don't understand the word gaslighting? Because that's one that gets thrown around a lot these days.
It does. It
So, Tim,
does.
give us the definition. What is the actual definition of gaslighting?
So gaslighting is essentially, it comes from the movie. There's an old black and white movie that really talks about this, and it is it's psychologically manipulative. Wish Michael would come up, because he can speak to this as well. Hint, hint, wink, wink.
Drop us a
I know he's
comment.
watching. But gaslighting is where you are engaging to get the person to question their own sense of reality of what they're seeing and understanding. And so gaslighting tactics include denial, twisting narratives, shaming, and blame shifting. Oh, oh no, I didn't do that. You must have you that what somebody else. So they're taking denial and then putting it onto the other person and getting the other person to question their sense of sanity and reality. But it ties into narcissistic traits. Now, with gaslighting tactics that are denial, twisting narratives, shaming, and blame shifting, it falls into those narcissistic traits. And it can happen in apologetics, where it is ego driven debates, refusal to admit error, and manipulation of dialogue. So, a lot of times, what I do is I'll test the waters by saying, well, this is what you wrote out. This is what I basically use their own words against them. No, 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 you misunderstand. You're gaslighting me. No, I'm not. These are your words. So help me understand. Otherwise, it just seems that you're coming across as being dishonest and manipulative. So help me understand this. But they don't want, because they don't want to accept accountability. They don't want to say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I made a mistake. I made a statement in error. because that's humility. But because ego wants to rear its ugly head, it drives a lot of these discussions. And it's a refusal to admit error on one part. And then it manipulates the dialogue. No, that's not what I said. And part of manipulation is using the typical logical fallacies, the red herrings, the moving the goalposts. In fact, I was on a TikTok live the other day and yesterday, and the gentleman mentioned 2 Nephi 25:23. I was able to come up and says, read the next verse, read the next verse, read the next verse. Now, what is the context actually saying? And he wouldn't answer the question. I said, either you're not willing to answer the question because you know that you are being dishonest and manipulative and not rendering the text accordingly from an exegetical perspective because you're relying on eisegesis proof text. And then he kept trying to shut me down. Said, no, I'm not going to leave this alone. So either you admit that you're lying and deceiving people because you're being manipulative here, or and then he's tried to jump to a different topic. Well, they're talking about Christ, and Christ wasn't known. And I said, no, let's focus on the context. You use that out of context. Let's address the context. If I'm wrong, show me. If you're wrong, you need to admit that you're wrong. And then they dropped me because I was getting a bit heated, hot under the collar, like I normally do in those discussions. And then, and I don't know if he blocked me or what, but those are how those conversations turn out. Because when you get to hold them accountable to what they're saying and show them and bring evidence, they will deny it. They will manipulate it. They'll try to move the dialogue to a different one because they don't want to have to deal with the possibility that they have to say, oh yeah, you're right, I was in error. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, maybe this is where those remarks that Elder Holland gave really matter because, I mean, okay, first of all, that musket fire analogy, just for context, when they were building the Nauvoo temple and these people were being chased out of town, right? Like they had a very short amount of time to hurry and finish it. That there was this statement by Brigham Young where he was basically like, we're going to finish this temple, even if we have to have a musket in one hand and like whatever it was, like a hammer or tool
A
in
trowel
another
in the
hand.
other.
Yeah, a trowel in the other. That's what it was. And anyway, so there's this idea that this is in defense, right? It's not an offense. And
Mhm.
it's really difficult when someone is it would because what you start to notice is it's like you think that it's a sincere question. You're right. Oftentimes it goes into this kind of like weird gaslighting thing where they start doing this like blame shifting. You start to notice these little narcissistic traits, and then you kind of have to realize what you're dealing with. And then the question is, can you defend with this person, or is this going to like devolve into something that completely derails your real goal and your real mission, which is like build the temple, right? So I guess this is where, like, for me, if I start getting a sense of this early on in a conversation, I usually stop right there and I let it go, because I
Right.
am not the type of person who wants to persist in that. I'm more of the type of person who, I've said this the other day when we were over on Sam's channel talking about this on Through the Mist, but I think it's better to do like it says in the Doctrine and Covenants and um, just shake off the dust from our feet. And this is actually a scripture from Matthew. And I want to say it's like Matthew, is it maybe like 14? It's somewhere in there, and maybe I'll find it and we can read it. But it comes from the New Testament. It was repeated twice in the Doctrine and Covenants in that context where it's like, we have a mission. It's to take the gospel to the world. It's not
Mhm.
to engage with people who don't have a sincere desire, or to engage with enemies. And that's pretty much the idea there. So it's Matthew 10:14, and it says, "And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when ye depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet." And so I had cross-referenced this. I found that there are similar uses across the canon of this exact phrase or something similar to this phrase. And all of them are in connection with departing. Some of them say depart quickly. So I think for me, this was like Mark 6:11 says a similar thing. It says, and whosoever shall not receive you nor hear you, when ye depart thence, shake off the dust under your feet for a testimony
Mhm.
against them. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. And then Luke said the same thing. And he just said, when you go out of the city, shake off the dust of your feet for a testimony against them. But in Doctrine and Covenants, it's more specific. It says, and shake off the dust of thy feet against those who receive thee not, not in their presence, lest you provoke them, but in secret. And wash thy feet as a testimony against them in the day of judgment. And then it also says, and this one's, that one was 60:15, this one's 75:20 in the D&C. And it says, and in whatsoever house ye enter, and they receive you not, ye shall depart speedily from that house and shake off the dust of your feet as a testimony against them. Now, when the Gospels were being written, this was in hindsight. This was after Jesus had already
Right.
been crucified. So they may not have remembered it verbatim, but you do get more enlightenment through the Doctrine and Covenants on what the Lord is really asking us to do. And something that I thought was kind of interesting too is I had looked up the phrase shake off, and I could see that there were different connections to the idea of like the fruit being shaken off of the branch or the vine. Like in Job 15:33, it says, he shall shake off his unripe grape as the vine and shall cast off his flower as the olive. And I thought this was really interesting because this is kind of an assessment of what you're dealing with. When you are dealing with
Mhm.
somebody who immediately starts gaslighting, who immediately starts, doing these kind of normal tactics, these very classic tactics, this is the counsel that God has given us. And so for me, I think where I've spent a lot of my time is how do I discern, like, at what point do I shake off the leaves and, just leave it be and put and give it over to God and just let him handle those people? Because if my message or like if my mission, as a member of the tribe of Israel who is part of this covenant with the Lord, and my mission is to help bring people into that covenant through the ordinances of the gospel, through missionary work for the living and the dead, then how can I best facilitate the Lord's goal to bring people into his
Mhm.
family? Is it better for me to spend a lot of time with somebody who's antagonistic towards me personally and making personal attacks on me? Is that healthy for me? Is it right for me? Will that edify and uplift my soul and spirit? Or is it going to allow Satan to chip away at my armor? And I ask myself this a lot because I'm not the type of person who can deal with that a lot. I am the kind of person who is I'm very emotional, I'm very empathetic, I love
Right.
people, and I can see past people's flaws and see, like, the child of God in them, but if they start attacking me personally, and maybe this speaks to my own personal trauma, but it, like, brings up bad feelings for me because I
Right.
have been mistreated in my life, and so for me, I cut that off immediately, and I'm upset with anybody who would even treat me that way. Like for me, that's not a person I want to have anything to do with. And there's a reason for that. It's because I have to protect myself spiritually too.
Right. Well, and it comes down to the reality that sometimes it's hard to not take it personally because when it's personal, it does get personal and it does get frustrating, and we allow our emotions to go unchecked, and I'm guilty of this all the same time. And it reminds me of working in the year, over the years I've worked in a various capacities, working as a call center rep. And we all know we've been that customer, and I've been on the other end of the line with somebody who's just belligerent and upset. And a lot of times they're just trying to push that one button to see how you react to that. And so I think a lot of times is that they're not doing it to learn, they're doing it to understand. They're doing it because they want to get your goat. And sometimes we fall into that trap. I know I did. I remember one specific call. I was working as a wireless data technician, and this gal was calling in because she wanted to get a brand new phone, but she didn't qualify for anything. And I was doing everything. And this turned into an hour and a half phone conversation. And towards the end of it, she just finally flat out says, "You need to stop being a corporate monkey and grab a pair and 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 literally was very demanding about it. And I said, "Here's me grabbing a pair. You don't deserve a phone. You're better off going somewhere else. Have a nice day and have a nice life." And I was being monitored, of course, one of those calls that I happened to be monitored on. And my supervisor came over and he was trying hard not to laugh, but he's like, "You cannot talk to our customers like that." I said, even if she deserved it. And I agree with you, but you can't, because we do take it personal. We can't take it personal. And I love the saying with Brigham Young where he says that uh those who take offense when no offense is given is a fool, and those who take offense when offense is given is a greater fool. And so the reality is we do not walk in foolish statements. There's a passage in Proverbs that says that we do not answer a fool. Um, we don't give an answer to a fool, because a lot of times that's what they are. They're internet trolls who are just being very foolish, and they're trying to get your goat, trying to get a response, or trying to get the a way. So that's their
Like they're provoking.
sense of, they're provoking. They want to provoke. They're the ones that want to provoke. And one of my favorite lines out of the movie Roadhouse with Patrick Swayze, not one,
Oh, I
is
like
when
that
somebody
one.
says, "Well, what?" Yeah, you know which one I'm going. Where he's standing there
Super
and he says,
classic.
"Well, if somebody, well, what if somebody calls me a blank something or other?" And he says, "Well, it's two nouns put together to explicit a prescribed response." And so when we think of how critics come at us, think of those who have left the church and they come after us in social media contexts and conversations. They have a prescribed playbook that they're operating under because they're trying to get a prescribed response. And a lot of times, I know back in the day with the whole "I'm a Mormon" campaign and Facebook and all these communities, and I called them mom pop counter cult ministry Facebook groups. They would prop up and they would run back to their echo chambers and they would say, "Yeah, they can't respond." Da, da, da. So they're virtually high fiving each other, and we've done it. We've done it the same as well. Um, but at the end of the day, are you trying to win an argument, or are you trying to stand firm in your faith and your testimony? And I think that's a very gray area, especially when it comes to, because our beliefs are very personal. Our beliefs are what makes us, it's how we identify ourselves. And sometimes it's hard not to take it personal.
Well, because
Sometimes,
it's so much a part of who you are as a
right.
person. Like you make your decisions based off of what you believe, you raise your family based off of what you believe, all of those things. So, yeah, like, I mean, how do you know when to like go to battle, or when to just let it go, shake off the dust and,
Mhm.
go to the mattresses is from The Godfather. This is like I had put this in the comments. Like, how do you know when to go to the mattresses and when to shake off the dust? Like when to go to battle and you know that you're
Right.
going to get into a really thick, heavy battle versus like shake off the dust. Like do you have like for example, Tim, think of like times where you've gotten into it really thick with someone and you're experiencing those things that you're describing, like the gaslighting, the ad hominem attacks, maybe like the denigration that sometimes people
Mhm.
spew, that vitriol. How do you respond, and like how do you decide, okay, this is a time to war into battle, or this is a time to shake off the dust and let it go?
Well, like what happened on TikTok with that one gentleman that I basically just say, because I kept getting muted, and I just finally says, "I'm not going to put up with this. You're lying, you're deceiving, and you're being you're intellectually castrated because you're not open and receptive to anything anybody wants to say from a Latter-day Saint perspective. And I don't care if you drop me, I don't care if you block me, but I need to get that out and I need to say that." And then all of a sudden, "Oh, look, the demon spirits are rising up. Ah, he's so angry. Da, 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 da." No, I'm frustrated because they're being bullheaded. And so you got to call it out, the behavior out for what it is. And then you just leave. There have been times when I've started typing out a response and then I'm reading through it and I'm like, "No, it's not even worth it. It's not even worth it." And then I hit delete. I don't even publish it. I don't even post it, and da da da. And then there are times where I just kind of feel out the conversation, and then I could see it's like chess. If you are familiar with chess, you got to know 4 or 5 moves of your opponent before they make those moves. And so you got to prepare yourself for what may come next. Now, I don't know if it's an unfortunate aspect or understanding of this, but the reality is that if you're familiar with the anti-LDS tropes and the anti-Mormon playbook, you already know how the conversation is typically going to go. Now, for those who are new to apologetics or new to sharing the gospel online, and they find themselves getting into these conversations, they may not have that understanding. This is why you want to bring in somebody who's been seasoned, who's a veteran in this. But there are other times where I've actually had some conversations with people, and it did get tense, it did get thick, but it was that mutual respect where we walked away. He says, okay, now I understand where you're coming from. Now I understand, but it's still that it's that whole iron sharpening iron. And that's where we can learn from those things. We can learn from how we have those conversations and then build from that.
What do you think the distinguishing factor is? Like, if you had to characterize the difference between like getting into the thick of it, but still feeling like it's the iron sharpening iron thing versus like, the person who's going to give you the tropes, they're
Mhm.
clearly not sincere and they do want to just do the personal attacks. Like, how do you distinguish and then determine the action and what is the appropriate action?
Well, it's based on how they're responding to my questions and my response. Because I'll ask very specific questions. I'll put up and I'll say, well, this is what you said. So let's go with the example of 2 Nephi 25:23. I said, well, you said that this is in contradiction with Ephesians 2:8-9. However, let's look at are you willing to look at the context for that? And what does the context say? Now, how do you understand the text there? But the problem is getting them out of the typical eisegesis reading of the text and get them to actually look at the text for what it is to draw out the meaning. And a lot of times they're not willing to do that because they're so entrenched with their confirmation bias that they can't bring themselves to step out of that. And so sometimes you have to walk them. And if they're not, I said, well, it sounds like you're not being open or receptive to this. So I'm not going to have this conversation with you. Now, one of the most famous individuals that we probably are familiar with online, if you've had any associations on Facebook, is PG. I think most people will know who I'm referring to with that. Even some of the missionaries that have come and served in this area that I've gotten to know who PG is. And he reached out to me one day about last year, and he says, "Hey, I want to have let's debate." I said, "Well, I don't really debate. I'd rather have a discussion, and I have some questions before we even consider doing this discussion." And the first one is, are you able to envision the possibility that you might be in error, that you might be wrong, and you need to correct that? Well, yeah. I'm like, okay. The next question is, well, so if one of your arguments is shown to be faulty, are you willing to correct that? And then usually they don't get past that second question because it devolves into, uh, yeah, righteous trouble. That's that, who I'm talking about. Um, and then it's like, well, they'll make up an excuse because I don't even get to the third question. But that's something I've put into this that we can hopefully get to and have a conversation on, because it's really about setting boundaries to have these healthy conversations. That if somebody wants to talk with us, we need to have those healthy boundaries in place, not to lord over them our knowledge and understanding, but to protect ourselves,
Mhm.
so that we don't fall into the trappings of getting caught up emotionally, that we can just stick to the facts for what they are. My favorite literary line from Charles Dickens, Hard Times, is facts. You got to teach them the facts. And so sometimes we just need to get to the level of, this is what the facts are. This is how I understand them. And you lay that out. And if that person's not willing to come along and have that conversation with you, then really it's not worth anybody's time. And so
So,
that goes.
Well, I just have a question for you.
Yeah.
So, like, you're talking about setting healthy boundaries, and I like
Mhm.
the sound of that. And so, I guess I'm just kind of wondering, what does that look like, and then how do you set them? I think that question you just said is like probably step number one. It's like, okay, well, are you open to thinking for a minute that you may be wrong? I'm wondering if
Mhm.
there's even a better way to phrase it. Like, if somebody's even if they aren't willing to consider that they're wrong or that their belief is not correct, about like what they personally believe theologically, or like just with their own gospel doctrine, but if they are willing
Mhm.
to um, consider that their belief about me or what I believe might not be quite right. Um, I don't know, like, because I feel like as soon as you like, if somebody were to come to me and be like, Jessica, can you possibly consider that the church isn't true? I'd be like, no, because I won't do that because
Well,
I
and,
feel like
and
I
that's
already know it's true. But I am willing to hear what someone else believes and why they believe it. If they believe that it's not true, I'm willing to
right.
consider why.
Well, you bring up a really good point because when I've asked people that question, they're like, "Well, what about you?" I said, "This isn't about me. This is about the conversation. You're the one that's asking me to have a conversation with you." And so for me to grasp the understanding of whether it's going to be worth my time to have the conversation, I'm asking you if there's a possibility that you might be wrong because you're going to be bringing to the table arguments that you think are right and true. You think are fact based. You think that there's evidence that's going to be supporting. So really, it isn't about me. It's about whether or not you're willing to consider that those arguments, those criticisms, those claims might actually be faulty. And are you willing to abandon them and adopt what evidence does show forth? And so, yeah, it is a good point, and it's kind of a sticky point because they want to put it on me, or they want to put it on other people, saying, "Well, what if I prove to you that the church is wrong?" Say, "Okay, it's fine. If it's wrong, then I will admit. If I'm wrong in an error, I'm more than happy to willing to admit." But the conversation isn't about me. The conversation is about the reason you want to have it with me. So if somebody says, "I want to have a conversation with you about polygamy," okay, are you open and receptive that anything that you bring to the table might be wrong, might be erroneous, might be faulty? And are you willing to abandon those faulty arguments and criticisms and not use them going forward? Well, no. Okay, then that's not a conversation worth having. And sometimes you
Mhm.
can't do that in the because sometimes we're shooting from the hip, so to speak, because we get caught off guard, or questions just come seem to come out of nowhere. But we need to recognize them for what they are, and then and get into that. So yeah, it goes into the next point: healthy conversations and resilient strategies. So we want to always be promoting Christ-like love. We want to, and I think this is where it gets to where we need to contend for the faith. We need to contest the criticisms and not allow them to go uncontested, because we need to be able to be the voice of clarity and the voice of resilience in responding to criticism. And it's not so much responding to the individual that's making the criticism and argument, it's responding to the audience in relationship to it, because they're going to show their hand. And when you step out of being emotionally manipulated and you respond to the reality of, say, and you respond appropriately, and you respond in a position of being healthy, people are not dumb. They're going to see the conversation for what it is. They're going to see and take notice that that person is not being respectful. They're not being honest. They're not being forthright. They're being dishonest. They're being manipulative.
Yeah, but sometimes people revel in that. Like the conversation we were having the other day with Sam on Through the Mist, there were two people in that chat and they were egging each other on. They were giving each other little high fives in the comments and they were reveling in their vitriol.
Right.
How do you
Well, and
deal
I've
with
seen
that?
that happen too. Well, you can't really. People are people. They're going to do what people do best, especially with online and social media. And so you have to really ignore the where they're reveling in. And sometimes it's just stepping out of the conversation. One of my favorite quotes is George Bernard Shaw. And George Bernard Shaw says, "I learned long ago not to wrestle with pigs because you get dirty and they like it." And that's what they're reveling in. They're reveling in their mess. They're reveling in their, because they want to. get your goat. They want to get you to respond so they can say, see, look, they're being mean to me. They're look at the persecution complex, because then they're going to turn it around. And that's where the gaslighting comes into play with that. And so we want to always respond with strength, humility, and patience. We avoid being reactive. And I always say, this is where emotional intelligence comes into play, because most of the time we're naturally prone to being emotionally reactive. However, we need to discipline ourselves to be emotionally responsive. We need to respond in a way that understands where this person is coming from. And that comes by way of discernment and relying on the Holy Spirit. And so we want to encourage disengagement from toxic exchanges and focus on building testimony through scripture, prayer, and guidance from our leaders. And then we navigate these criticisms of grace, where we respond with strength, humility, and patience. We avoid reactive defensiveness. We do want to defend. We want to be defensive, but we want to be responsive in our defense. And then we need to see criticism as an opportunity to witness truth and love. Well, that and this is where we get into the whole, we got to drop the you statements instead of you don't understand what I'm saying, to where I haven't been very clear in what I've attempted to express, what I believe. Because the minute you bring it to yourself, they can't take that away from you. But the minute you say you're putting them into the defensive posture.
Guys, I have met these kinds of people. I've had enough of like these types of people in my life. Like, for me, look, there's very few things that matter to me more than living the gospel and helping my children live it. And
Right.
I think everything else is kind of like, lower on the priority list for me. And so when I see people who may be struggling to live the gospel, but they're very angry towards the church and they're very angry towards me just for being a member of the church, it depends on
Mhm.
how close of a relationship I have to them. So, for example, if this is someone that I have to engage with regularly and be civil with all the time, whether it be a friend, a coworker, a family member, I work very hard to maintain a relationship on whatever grounds I
Right.
can, because sometimes there's people who they are very angry. They might be like people who have left the church or are struggling to believe that it's true. There's people who maybe just grew up that because I have a lot of friends and family who are not members of our church, like, the majority are not.
Mhm.
So, for me, this is a pretty frequent thing, and I have had to learn how to just find common ground with everybody that I love and care about, because there's so many people on that list of people that I consider those that I love and I care about, as people who are also kind of antagonistic toward my faith. So,
Right.
I have to navigate this a lot on a very personal level. It's not just people on social media, it's people in my own personal life. And so those people, I work really hard to love them and see them as children of God, see them as my brothers and sisters. Most of them are my family and friends, like, for real. So it's like I do love them because we've had so many, like, good times together in spite of our differences, and I can swing that, I can do that. But that's because they're not, like, constantly personally attacking me. Now, when I meet strangers online, when I meet people that I don't know and they're personally attacking me, I just don't even waste my time. I'm just like, "You know what? I don't need to subject myself to somebody's abuse." Like, why do I need to do that? Especially somebody I don't even know.
Right.
So I do kinda leave those ones to God. So for me, it's kinda like, do I need to maintain a relationship here? Is it important that I maintain a relationship here? Do I feel inspired to do that? And if I do, and the answer is yes, then I'll work very hard to kind of, like, overcome whatever the tension is, I'll try to, like, soften that tension. But if it's, like, some random person who's not willing to identify who they really are to me, and they're not willing to, like, not attack me personally, then I feel perfectly comfortable letting it go and just being like, "Nope, sorry. I will do whatever I have to do to eliminate that contact from my life." especially if they
Right.
get like really personal and they're constantly coming at me. If it's like one random comment on a video or something, which I get literally every day, it's fine. Those ones I'm just like, whatever. But if it's like somebody who's like there was a time where I was doing a live stream and we were trying to have a gospel discussion. Now, I don't do a lot of like apologetics debates on my channel. That's just not my thing. I do a lot of like gospel discussion, like exploring our
Mhm.
own theology and our own gospel doctrine, because I just feel like our doctrine is so rich. There's so much there, and it makes for
Right.
really great discussions that uplift me. And so I spend more time on that. So when somebody comes into a chat and they're like, or a live stream and they're like, just boom, 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 being antagonistic or bringing up things that have nothing to do with what we're talking about, then I'm just kind of like, okay, we'll see how far it goes if they keep doing it. Like there was this one time where somebody literally made like 5 or 6 comments in a row that had nothing to do with what we were talking about. It was just attacks on Mormonism. And I literally
Right.
just blocked them. Like I was just like, we're done. Like you don't belong here. This isn't for you. Go find where you belong. And I did
Right.
not feel bad about that at all.
And sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you do have to use that block feature to just say, you know what, I had enough of your shenanigans, and you know, and deal with that. Uh, and and yeah, it because it's different when you're dealing with somebody that you are intimately in and that's probably not the right phraseology to use, but somebody that you know personally. It's different when you know that individual and you're attempting to have conversations with them. There is some level of respect, but there can also be the trappings of passive aggressiveness within that. That's part of toxic apologetics, is the passive aggressiveness, and I think that's the biggest issue for me. Um, However, how do we respond? And I think one of the things is we need to understand that a lot of the critics, and I'm not talking about the Exmos, I'm talking about the evangelical Christians out there who go to seminars, who go to where they have their whole sermon that's being preached over the pulpit is about how to witness to the Mormons. And I think there's this idea that's been planted in a lot of the evangelical Christian community that there to see us as victims. In fact, that's one of the things that is pointed out in Truth and Love's. I did a blog post about this a few years ago, where they are teaching people to see us as victims in relationships to that. It's like how we're not victims. When you think of a victim, you think of somebody who's being oppressed or somebody who's being abused, and just by that definition, you could say evangelical Christians can be victims. And so it just goes to show that they're using these in recovery, we call them loaded phrases or loaded language. So you're using these loaded languages and statements to get people to buy into this type of understanding of how to view us that is not in a healthy light or in a respectable light. That, oh, you need to see them as a victim. They don't know, they're ignorant, they don't know what they're talking about, they don't even know their own history, they they don't study the scriptures like we do. And so people are buying into this because it's so easy to hear that. And then when they come, and they won't talk to somebody like Travis Anderson, they won't talk to somebody like Robert Bolin, they will not engage those people with conversations. But what they'll do is they'll go after the missionaries, they'll go after the youth, they'll go after somebody who's very weak and in a faith crisis. And so and it's that, when you look at it, I see it in a way where they're going after the weakest link, because if you can get the weakest people to crumble, then you're already convinced that the those of us who are veterans, those of us who are very knowledgeable in understanding and navigating these, then you see that they're already of the opinion that we're destined for eternal punishment and torment. And so they'll engage, but they'll quickly disengage because they don't want to deal with that level of knowledge. They don't want to level up, so to speak, because they want to go after the low hanging and the easy fruits.
That just seems really sad to me because, I mean, I just feel like there's a lot of like unrighteous judgment in what you just said, because we're supposed to make like judgments. Sure, we have to be able to discern truth from error,
Right.
and we've been given permission to do that from the Lord, but to make a final judgment, we have not been given permission to do that. We've been told the opposite. And I feel like, I don't know, like this idea, like when you're dealing with somebody and you're talking with someone who has determined your eternal destiny based on their view and understanding, this is an unrighteous judgment. And I think the scriptures are
Right.
really good at defining the difference. It's if you're talking about a final judgment versus like, just somebody's in error, maybe they might not fully
Right.
understand the gospel. I mean, we all have a different view of the gospel, like even across Protestantism, there's like a million different views of the gospel. There's a million different denominations. There's a
Right.
million different like ways of interpreting scripture. And so this tells you something. It tells you that there's a personal element here. There's a certain level of understanding here. And I just feel like, um, when is blocking appropriate? Let me get back to that in just a second. Remind me, Tim, to answer that in just a second. But I feel like when it comes to this like final judgment, kind of like or passing judgment in that way, this is a block for having the ability to really converse with somebody, to really get to know what they believe, to really understand who they are as a person. Because when you have like
Right.
a preconceived notion of who someone is and where they're going, how do you connect with them? Okay, how do you connect? Now, to answer the question, when is blocking someone appropriate? Well, I gave an example a minute ago of there was a time where I was having a discussion. It was like more of like it was like a second coming kind of eschatology discussion. And there was somebody who kept coming into the comments. They seemed to be some type of other Christian faith, and they were talking about Mormons aren't Christians. They were, talking about the Trinity, saying things like we're Satan worshipers. I mean, it was really strange, first of all, because we weren't talking about anything that had to do with other Christian beliefs or anything like that. And they just were, it was like one after the other. And you could tell that they were purposely trying to like clog up the feed with like the chat. With those types of remarks. They were clearly provoking, and after it was like the 6th or 7th one, I was like, "Okay, this is it was spam." At that point, like, it was spam.
Right.
And so I was just like, "Sorry," and so I blocked the person, and I literally, like, said I was just like, "Bye, see ya, go away, you're blocked, nobody's gonna see your comments anymore." Because it just that's the kind of thing where it's like, this is a troll. Like, this is trolling and spamming. And so immediately for me, that's like block. We don't have time for that. The other ones can be a little trickier. Like we had the one the other day where, there's some people in the chat and they're making really personal remarks. They're doing some of the ad hominem stuff. They're doing definitely the gaslighting like accusations
Right.
and all of those like things that Tim just mentioned. And those can be a little trickier because it's like, and I get a variety of opinions on this. Like some people are like, no, I like this. I'm happy to have a conversation with them, and they have more of like a diplomatic kind of forgiving approach. I don't. I really don't. Like I am not that person. And I'm okay. Like I'm proud to admit the fact that I don't put up with crap because I've put up with enough of it in my life. Like I don't feel like I need to. I don't feel bad if I'm not tolerating it. I don't feel like I don't know, like I don't know, doing a disservice to someone by not taking their crap, and I don't feel like I have to put up with it because I think that there's enough of like I don't know, like a justified like defense measure in my mind for me to just be like, nope,
Right.
sorry. You know what I mean? Like boundaries. You talked about boundaries. For me, that's a
Right.
boundary. And so I think it may vary from person to person on those things. For me, like some of the things that we were experiencing the other day, as soon as somebody started making it really personal and saying personal things towards me, I would probably ghost them or block them because I just don't want to allow that into my life. I feel like what I take into my mind and my heart, it matters. It matters a lot in terms of my ability to have positivity and like joy in my life. It matters to me for how I parent my children, because I'm not the type of person who can compartmentalize a lot. I think this might be a male female thing. Maybe that's a separate discussion. But I find that my husband can do it a little bit more than I can do it. And I just understand me as a person, that that's not something that I can do. And I do think about my children.
Right.
And I'm like, well, I don't want this affecting what I have to give to my kids and to my family. So if I feel like there's like something hurting inside my heart and I sense that right away, to me, that's it. I'm done.
Right. Well, and I want to point out, Doubting Thomas 1, he mentions his question is, let me go back up here a little bit, where it says, interesting, I think it's likely the confusion of using the term apologist versus evangelism. Apologist typically has the connotation of defense and debate regarding the faith versus spreading the faith. And yeah, I agree. Apologetics comes from the term Greek apologia. It means to give a defense. It means to give a defense of your faith, whether it's in written form or in now in a classic for you Plato's Apology and things like that. But today, I think it has become more of a misnomer. It has become more of a just one of those phrases we just throw out, and I think it has convoluted um, the idea of missionary work, evangelism. And when we share the gospel, we do want to share it in truth and love. We do want to engage in missionary work or evangelism. However, part of that is also being able to give a response, a valid response, whether in season or out of season, as the scripture says, to give a response in defense of the reason you believe what you believe. And it must be rooted in compassion and not contention. So there's a difference between contending and contention, because I think a lot of the times, and I've gotten flack from this over the years by members of our own faith, where they're saying, "Well, you have this, you're behaving with the spirit of contention, and that's of the devil." And I'm like, no, you have to understand the difference between contending for the faith versus engaging in a spirit of contention. And I think either if you're not engaged in any form of defending the faith, especially online through social media, you may see it as having a spirit of contention, and people just avoid it altogether. Well, which is fine. If that's you do you is my motto, because not all of us can actually do what we do. Some of us just want to be able to share the gospel without any uh interference from critics, and we just automatically just say, I'm not going to deal with that, and that's fine. That I'm not saying anything wrong is that's wrong. Um and if that keeps you from actually getting caught up in that, that's fine. That works. However, if you are going to engage, these are practical ways to do it where we can contend for the faith in truth and love and not have that spirit of contention. And again, like I said, sometimes you have to call out a person's attitude and behavior for what it is, and calling it out and saying, no, you're outright lying, you're outright being deceptive, you're outright being manipulative, and I'm not going to stand for it. It's setting those hard line boundaries and saying, look, you've crossed the line and I'm going to push back on it.
Tim,
That's contending.
there's some scriptural support for what you're saying. Would you like me to share some? Because
Sure.
I think you're right, and I think it's nice sometimes to go and maybe illustrate it a little bit from the scriptures. Now, first of all, if you look up contend and contending in the scriptures, I'm just going to note that there's really no like positive outcomes in these situations for
No, there's
someone.
not.
It always ends in like war, bloodshed, somebody like it's got a negative, bad ending whenever contending has to happen.
Yeah.
But there are
Iron
times when it
sharpens
does.
iron and you get hurt and wounded.
Well, I mean, you can think of like Captain Moroni, for example, when he had to contend with the
Right,
Lamanites over the safety of his
right.
people, and he did this in defense, and we had the title of liberty and that whole story. So there's one example. There's others, like in the Old Testament. You have times where like someone has to contend with a king or some type of
Mhm.
ruler, like for example in Nehemiah 13:11, then contended I with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place. And there's times where this is necessary, so that you can, I don't know, like, to your point, you can establish a boundary, and that boundary is very important. So sometimes you have to contend for a boundary to be set. Sometimes you have to contend for a defense. And this
Right.
is, I think, those examples, like Captain Moroni is a good one because he's like, hey, we're
Mhm.
doing this in defense of our family and our faith and our freedom. And we have to set a boundary. And he lays out, he gives opportunity for them to retreat and basically leave them alone. And when they don't, it ends in bloodshed, and that's what ends up happening.
Right.
And then we
Right.
have the law of war and forgiveness and the doctrine and covenants, which we've covered this year on the Come Follow Me. So if you look at the past Come Follow Me's, I think that was it like section 98, maybe? It was like
Mhm.
98-ish, somewhere around there. And these are important laws and rules that God has given us to help us know how to contend without getting into that contention, which is of the devil. And you see
Mhm.
Alma and Jacob contending in the Book of Mormon with Sherem and Korhor. These do not have positive outcomes for these people that they're contending with. And you see that handled in a certain way. So there are examples of what it looks like to contend in a righteous manner. And it is a very fine line. And it usually
Right.
requires some type of protection and defense, not of that one single person, but of the house of Israel.
Right. Well, and you mentioned scripture, and the two scriptures that kind, I think you've already mentioned this. One of them is when they contended with Zeezrom. I think the story of Zeezrom in the Book of Mormon is the exact blueprint that we ought to fall in line with on how we respond to critics and criticisms. And then there's another one. Cohort is another one. Another example of how we can contend for the faith and stand in defense and give a sound and reasonable response. Because the overall goal, whether it's evangelism and sharing the message of the gospel, missionary work, and things like that, especially online, is to allow the Holy Spirit to work in the hearts of men so that the process of conversion can happen. It's not about us to win arguments, it's not about a conquest of arguments, it's about reaching people and preaching the gospel and bringing people into that relationship, and for us it's that covenantal relationship for it. And so with that, I want to kind of pivot here a bit because I mentioned this. There is a thing that when I started getting into college coursework, they had us do a study on proper netiquette. There is a netiquette form for engaging in online conversations. And I kind of morphed this into or assimilated this into how we can engage. I call it mindful Latter-day Saint apologetics. That's my whole shtick here is to really get to a place of being mindful in how we share the message of the gospel, how we respond to social media. I'm not perfect. I'm human. I falter. I mess up sometimes, and I have to go and humble myself and then apologize when I've gotten a bit out of line. But to implement a way of being following the idea of what netiquette is that first is to listen and then respond. And this comes up with the passage of James where he says that we are to be slow to anger, slow to listen, that we have to be quick to hear and slow to respond. And that's the idea. So we avoid reactive defensiveness. We want to be responsive in how we defend, but we don't want to react. And a lot of times we react emotionally. It's that knee jerk reaction. And then we avoid sarcasm, we avoid ridicule, or we avoid ad hominem attacks. And these fuel toxic cycles. Now, there's a difference between saying you are a liar, and then it seems that you're coming across as being deceptive. Now, it is a fine line, it's a slippery slope, so to speak. Um, but a lot of times people do take it personally, they do get offended. And then you acknowledge and validate their concerns. Even critics may raise sincere questions. So even we want to be able to say, I could see how that might be a bit frustrating, or I could see how that might be that comes across as being misunderstood. Or I can kind of what you're doing is you're validating what their perspective is in order to actually address their concern. And then you want to stay centered on scripture. We anchor our responses in Christ and the restoration of the gospel. And this comes down to where we need to be plugged into the scriptures. We need to understand what the scripture says. We need to be able to hide the word of God into our hearts and our minds and call it to remembrance when we need to do that. Because what's the very first thing Christ did when Satan came and tempted him, and he says, turn these rocks into bread and you can eat. And Christ says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. So we need to be able to hide the scriptures in our heart. And we need to hide the understanding of that so we can cite them, because not all the time are you going to be able to carry your scriptures with you. Not all the time are you going to be able to, you're engaging conversations. I have a various set of scriptures on my shelf behind me, but I don't pull them off my shelf when I go onto a TikTok live, or I do my research and I plug them into whatever it is I'm doing. But I also take the time to study and memorize them and commit them to memory. And sometimes I paraphrase it because I don't remember the exact phraseology of it. And so we need to have that. And this is where it kind of gets into putting on the armor of God, because if you look at the armor of God, there's only two pieces of that armor that actually are for defensive and offensive means. The first one, of course, is the sword of truth. And then the second one is the shield. Now, people say, well, the shield is more of a defensive, but it can also be used as an offensive weapon. It is there to protect us, but we can also use it offensively too and push back. And then we need to know when to disengage. Not every critic seeks dialogue. We need to discern intent. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right about discerning intent, because when you look at Jesus Christ and his example, he did that. He could perceive the hearts of the people that were in his presence, who were asking him questions. He knew if they were trying to be manipulative, he knew the intention of their hearts. I think one of the really great ones is the woman taken in adultery, right? Because he knew that those people who were speaking to him were also guilty, and it seems of similar things, because they were
Right.
convicted in their own hearts for what they were about to do. So the Lord seemed to perceive on a level that maybe we wouldn't necessarily be able to perceive. That seems to be a spiritual gift that he had. Maybe it had something to do with his divinity. But what I do think we do have the ability to do is have the gift of discernment, where you can discern spirits, you can discern truth from error. And this is a spiritual gift. It's one of the, I think, the best spiritual gifts, the most important. Like
Right.
I I asked, like, when my two little ones were going to be receiving their baby blessings, like, I talked to my husband about the spiritual gifts that I really wanted my children to have, that I wanted him to bless them with, and that was, like, my top priority, was, like, they really need the gift of discernment. And so he blessed them with that when they were babies. And what powerful blessings to be able to, like, really think about it beforehand, and to be able to have that given as a gift. And I think that it's because the kind of climate that we live in, I mean, we live in the last days. This is a very difficult, tricky time. We've been
Right.
told over and over again, this is the most difficult time in human history for this earth, and for our mortal journey as a human family. And we need to have these special spiritual gifts. So I think that you're right about discerning spirits, because, and like kind of discerning intent. I think that if you can start to pick up on some of those things that you were talking about earlier, like the techniques, the classic
Mhm.
tactics that people are using, you can understand and recognize when someone's gaslighting, when somebody's accusing you of gaslighting. You can pick up on the sense, the accusatory spirit. We talked about that when we were over on Through the Mist with Sam, and we were talking about the accusatory spirit. And I had brought that
Right.
up as just a sign of the type of person that you're dealing with. When you're dealing with somebody who's accusing you left and right when they do not know you, this is a huge sign of the spirit that possesses that person at that time.
Right. And this is not, while we're focusing on Latter-day Saints and how we respond to criticisms online, this is for any Christian who engages in discussing gospel related topics. This is not just for us. This is for all of us, Protestant, Catholic, evangelical, non-denominational, because there are a lot of times where I've had to come to the defense of fellow evangelicals and Protestants or Roman Catholics and things like that. And the other aspect is stick to what you know. Stay in your lane. Don't go above what you don't know. Because if you don't know a topic, you have no business entering into that arena to have that discussion. And it's okay to just say, you know what, that's a very good question. Let me take some time to research it to understand it. And then when you research it, don't just be one-sided in that. Look at the arguments for and arguments against. That's how we understand what is it that, and I think that's where we got into, where a lot of times when Latter-day Saint apologetics started out at the birth of the internet and started really playing catch up with the criticisms that has already been well established. Um, it was understanding the arguments and the criticisms for what they are, and then being able to provide a sound response to those criticisms. And it has evolved to now we have more information, we have more understanding, and we have surpassed that. We are no longer playing catch up. We are now being able to stand. It is those who are critical of our faith that are now attempting to try to play catch up because they're still locked into that confirmation bias of those outdated tropes that they've been relying on because they've read it somewhere in some 31 flavored anti-Mormon literature or website or conversations, and they don't give themselves over discussion. And sometimes it's either because they want to be willfully ignorant or they just are lazy learners. They don't want to learn from themselves. And that gets into the next point, and I kind of hinted at this in our conversation, and it's the proper flow of discussion. And this proper flow of discussion helps us establish how to engage and how to disengage. And so the very first premise is establishing willingness. Can you envision anything that would change your mind? And then you agree on rules of reason. Evidence, logic, and respect must guide the exchange, must guide the conversation, especially if you reach out and you want to have an actual conversation with somebody and you want to do it live streaming or however, people do it. This is how real people, rational human beings, have actual discussions. And then you stick with one claim at a time. And so one argument at a time. And this avoids the shotgun or cascading or the sharpshooting fallacies, because we know people will throw out, they'll regurgitate and vomit a bunch of things to overwhelm the conversation. And then the burden of proof applies equally. So both sides need to support their claims. So I just have as much responsibility to support my reasons to believe what I believe, as well as expecting other people to support what they believe. And then we look at it, we hash it out. And that's where the real heart of contention comes into play. When we contend, it's not so much about proving who's right and who's wrong. It's about contending and wrestling with what does the evidence show and what side of the fence does that evidence prove to stand as rational and the more logical aspect of it. And then that's what is to be deemed as the most sound aspect of that argument. And then we terminate if the rules are broken. We disengage if there's manipulation. We disengage if there's gaslighting. We disengage if there's a refusal to provide evidence, or a new topic or argument is introduced where the goalpost is being moved or logical fallacies are put into play. And so we do that in relationship to that. And I don't know if you want to give some thoughts on that and then go into and spend some time on breaking down the 10 common criticisms that we receive on social media, or we just leave that for our next live stream and have that as a part 2 conversation.
I think I agree with you. So I would say, rather than get my take on that, because I agree, we need to disengage. I feel like we're going to be beating a dead horse if we keep talking about that. So I would say let's move on to those most common criticisms. And I actually have a quote that I want to share from one of my friends on one of them. So when we get to that one, we will. But I had gotten this really great quote from a friend of mine. He had said it in one of my live stream discussions a while ago, and I think it applies sometimes. It's good advice. It's like an old Spanish, like an idiom or like a saying. And so, yeah, let's talk about those most common criticisms.
So the very first common criticism that we get on social media is the most prominent one. Mormons are not Christian, and I'm using the term Mormon loosely. I know the church has come out that we are to refer ourselves to as members of the Church of Jesus Christ or Latter-day Saints, or I personally use Latter-day Saint Christian. But in this context, this is how critics phrase it: Mormons aren't Christians. And it really comes down to not so much about discipleship. It comes down to one central core tenet of what a person views as a core essential doctrine of Christianity. And that's the view on the Trinity. And now somebody asks, what about the Trinity? Nobody understands that. The reason nobody understands that is because they're comfortable with the idea that it's such a great mystery and it's incomprehensible. So therefore, of course, it's going to be a person cannot comprehend or understand that. But the idea that Mormons are not Christian, the go-to claim that is always made in any social media interaction, it's probably the first question or the first statement that's made in any context. Somebody will come into a chat and say Mormons aren't Christian. They'll just throw that out. They'll just boom, it's right there. And then we get into that. Well, yes, we are. So we're trying to pivot and defend. Yes, we are. But we really don't get into the conversation of, well, okay, what do you mean? Well, you guys don't believe in the Trinity. Okay, well, how does that make a person a Christian or not if they don't believe in the Trinity? Where does that say it in Scripture that you have to adopt the idea that there's a three-person God that makes up the Trinitarian construct? Because again, this is going back to understanding Scripture and knowing what Scripture says. In certain exchanges that I've had personally, I just say, okay, can you show me in the New Testament what defines a person who is a Christian? How are they defined? Are they defined by a certain prescript of doctrines, or are they defined by something a lot that people most miss out and don't understand? And so it's about knowing how to navigate and ask those questions for that. So yeah, that's the most common one that gets dropped into any conversation online is Mormons aren't Christian, or why do you call yourselves Christian, or there is no Latter-day Saint Christian. That's a oxymoron. Somebody told me that on X one time. I know who it was, but we won't say his name.
Well, I agree with you on the Trinity thing. I think this definitely comes up probably the most. It's truly a defining feature between Latter-day Saint beliefs and other Christian beliefs. And I mean, I think that President Holland gave the best talk on this back in October 2007. He really just kind of went to bat for us. Again, he's a defender of the faith, he's got his musket in one hand and his trowel in the
Right.
other, right? And I think he's a good example of, ways that you can respond in boldness without maybe crossing that territory of contention. In fact, after he had given that one BYU speech that we were talking about earlier, he actually, I think it was later in the year, he had done an interview. It might have even been a few years ago, could have even been last year, but he ended up doing an interview. Let me see if I can. Yeah, so he did like a church news podcast interview. I think it was, I'm not sure what the year was. Oh, it was actually in 2024. So it was right after. And he felt sad about the response that people had to the musket fire analogy. They obviously didn't, some
Mhm.
people might have not known the context for that it was a comment that had to do with defending the faith and their desire to focus on what was most important, which was building the temple, and doing it in a way that kind of signaled the priority of the temple was one that was so important that they would need to defend it with their lives. That's the context for that musket fire analogy. And he was pretty sad about it. He actually said if anybody was hurt by the talk, and I know some were in that exchange, then I was hurt. If they were hurt, I was hurt, and I have wept. I have wept for those 3 years. So this is like a loving, compassionate person. Well, he took on
Mhm.
this doctrine of the Trinity, and he quoted Elder Ballard at one point in this talk, and he says in the talk, various cross currents of our times have brought increasing public attention to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Lord told the ancients this latter-day work would be a marvelous work and wonder, and it is. But even as we invite one and all to examine closely the marvel of it, there's one thing we would not like anyone to wonder about. That is whether or not we are Christians. So he tried to explain, how are we
Right.
Christians? So he says, by and large, any controversy in this matter has swirled around 2 doctrinal issues: our view of the Godhead and our belief in the principle of continuing revelation, leading to an open scriptural canon. So we get this all the time, right? The crux of most of these differences that we have, at least in terms of with other Christian faiths,
Right.
boils down to these 2 things. And I think this is a very accurate assessment. So he says, in addressing this, we do not need to be apologists for our faith, but we would like to not to be misunderstood. So with a desire to increase understanding and unequivocally declare our Christianity, I speak today on the first of those 2 doctrinal issues just mentioned. So he's going to address the Trinity. Our first and foremost article of faith in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is we believe in God, the eternal Father, and in his Son, Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Ghost. We believe these 3 divine persons constituting a single Godhead are united in purpose, in manner, in testimony, in mission. We believe them to be filled with the same godly sense of mercy and love, justice and grace, patience, forgiveness, and redemption. I think it is accurate to say we believe they are one in every significant and eternal aspect imaginable, except believing them to be 3 persons combined in one substance, a Trinitarian notion that never set forth in the scriptures because it is not
Right.
true.
Right. And that is very important to understand, and I love how he lays that out. I think when it comes to this idea that Mormons aren't Christian and we're having those conversations, one of the things that I've noticed within the last year or so is and I'm going to pivot here and I'm going to step on some toes. And sometimes we need to have our toes stepped on, and I'm just as guilty of this too. But I think there is it has become commonplace in our vernacular to differentiate ourselves in this realm of whether or not we're Christian, with separating ourselves from creedal Christians. That term has now become kind of pejorative. We've kind of weaponized that term and phraseology to kind of be a bit arrogant and condescending. And I'm not saying that that's the intention behind it, but if you take a step back, it kind of does come across as arrogance and pejorative.
It
Because
does,
if
and
you're
I
to
think
say
people
somebody,
are taking it that way, and if someone's taking
and
it that way, then maybe you shouldn't use it.
right, and so I think we need to and this is where it gets into that talk. I can't remember. You probably know who gave that talk. Words matter. A couple general conferences ago. What we say really does matter, and I think it's one of those phrases that we ought to just eradicate from our vernacular when we engage in these online conversations. That we need to just say, we need to just move away from the whole. Well, yeah, we're not creedal Christians. You could just say, well, yes, you're right. We're not Christians in the aspect that we don't embrace the doctrinity. Here's the reason why. And that's when we open up the avenues of conversation. If that person is receptive enough. And we know time and time again, most people just want to do a hit and miss. They want to do a drive-by posting of dropping that in the comments and just see how it unfolds, because it really does get uh, our panties in a bunch when somebody comes in and they drop that Mormons aren't Christian, and then all of a sudden we get upset and uptight saying, no, we're not, we are,
Yeah,
and well, and so that's the reactiveness. We react because we want to defend, because we've been told time and time again we are not Christians. And so, one, yes, you got to understand that this has been browbeaten and weaponized against us, but on the same hand, we've started using it as a way of browbeating and weaponizing the idea of, well, you're a credo Christian, that's why we're not Christians. And
Well,
so
and I think you're right because so that was Elder Rasband who gave that.
right,
And he said in that talk, he said, words matter. They're the bedrock of how we connect. They represent our beliefs, morals, and perspectives. Sometimes we speak words, other times we listen. Words set a tone. They voice our thoughts, feelings, and experiences for good or bad. Unfortunately, words can be thoughtless, hasty, and hurtful. Once said, we cannot take them back. They can wound, punish, cut down, and even lead to destructive actions. They can weigh heavily on us. And then he goes on and gives all these other examples of how words matter. But I think that when it comes to like this, like creedal Christian thing that you're talking about, I agree with you on this. I think that maybe we should just take this out of our vernacular. I mean, it's one thing to use it privately, but when you're in a conversation with somebody who does subscribe to the creeds, I think you just have to respect that because for them, for people who believe in the creeds, it's because they view those creeds as coming from some type of authority. And people
right,
who have a desire to understand God, they view authority differently than we do. They don't view it as like the priesthood keys and how we need the 12 apostles. Like they don't view it the same way as we do. And so, if so, it's kind of like if somebody says, well, you just believe, these prophets and apostles. And it's like if you don't understand the point of prophets
right,
and apostles, and you get this from people who are not of any faith, like people who are just completely outside of religion, you'll get this from them. You're just believing a bunch of people, a bunch of men, and so it's because they don't understand like our view of authority and that authority comes from God. So I think that you're right. We should try a little harder to be a little better, to use President Hinckley's words, in our words and how we're utilizing them. And if we're using them in
mhm,
a reactive way that's hasty and hurtful, like how Elder Rasband talked about, I think Elder Holland, he did a really good job in that talk when he was addressing the creeds. The way he worded it was like this. He said, after he made the statement about, not, we don't need to be apologists for our faith, but we don't want to be misunderstood. He said, the whole thing about, I think it's accurate to say we just don't believe that God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost are the same
right,
substance, that we see them as individual people. And he says that this Trinitarian notion is never set forth in the scriptures because it is not true. Well, the way he follows up with that, he says, indeed, no less a source than the stalwart Harper's Bible Dictionary records that, quote, the formal doctrine of the Trinity as it was defined by the great church councils of the 4th and 5th centuries is not to be found in the New Testament. So he's saying Harper's Bible Dictionary acknowledges the fact
mhm,
that the concept of the Trinity is not biblical, that it is something that came in the 4th and 5th centuries. And he says in
mhm,
response to the critics of us for believing in this separate being Godhead that is, unity in the sense of a figurative unity. So any criticism that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, says Elder Holland, does not hold the contemporary Christian view of God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost. It's not a comment about our commitment to Christ, but rather a recognition, accurate, I might add, that our view of the Godhead breaks with post-New Testament Christian history and
right,
returns to the doctrine taught by Jesus himself. And, people have argued, I've seen people argue this and trying to say that no, this is biblical. And they really, really, in my view, they're reaching because you can isolate
right,
one passage, one verse here and there, and you can kind of take that idea away if you completely isolate it out of context. But if you follow that through all of the biblical um, scriptures from the Old Testament to the New Testament in the KJV, it's really easy to see that that's not true, and that there was an ancient understanding of multiple deities, of like a
right,
father and a son, literally. And so I
right,
think that um, it's one of those mental jumping jacks that people have to do to try to justify it in the Bible. And it's not just Latter-day Saints who see this. I mean, biblical scholars see this. People who are not really Christian see this, but there may be a different faith. I mean, anyone who's had experience reading the Bible and like really
Mhm.
truly studying it is able to see this. It doesn't take a lot.
Right. Yeah, and and I was thinking of, the reason why I saying that it has been used more of a pejorative term in referencing, and even in conversations online. Oh, you're just a credo, you don't understand. Well, that's because you're a credo Christian. You embrace the false doctrines of the creeds. It would be like somebody who is a member of one of the splinter groups, and this happens. I've seen it online, but I've been referred to as a Brighamite. I follow the Brighamite. The Brighamites are the ones that are in apostasy. And the Brighamites are referencing to the main, church that was established through Joseph Smith, and then and so you see how that comes across when you actually take a step back and you breathe and you look at it for what it really is and say, okay, yeah, maybe I don't need to use that, and maybe I need to kind of just step away from that and just say, okay, well, I that's probably because we don't hold to the Trinity. So there's that the reality of accepting the reality. It's accepting the reality that they don't see us as Christians because of that sticking point doctrine. And we can say, yes, you're right. In that sense, I am not a Christian. It's okay to say that.
Yeah,
However, the the
I'm fine
the
saying
the the
that.
downside to that, the downside to that is they're going to say, well, see, you admit that you're not a Christian. No, I didn't say that I wasn't a Christian. I'm admitting to the reality that you understand I'm not a Christian because of your doctrinal viewpoint that I don't embrace the Trinity. There
Well,
is a
it's because
difference
it's not
in
even a doctrinal viewpoint. It's like literally a definition that they're subscribing to the word
right,
Christianity. It's not a biblical definition.
right,
And
right,
they're basically changing the definition of a word, and then they're going off of that changed definition. They're not going to the original
right,
root of what a Christian was.
right.
Because a Christian simple definition is someone who believes that Jesus is the Christ.
And follows him.
Yeah, and
And
follows him.
I said, really, if you want to understand who a Christian is, Christ established who a Christian is. If anyone is willing to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. For whoso shall find his life shall lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake shall find it. That is the pure definition of a Christian right there. It's your willingness to enter into that relationship where you deny yourself of all things. You forsake all things for his name's sake. You lose yourself in order to find your true identity and purpose in him. That marks a true Christian. It's not about doctrine. It's not about what church you attend. And it's not about what Bible translation you're reading from. It's, are you willing to live your life according to his will and purpose and according to his teachings so that you can then be one who's growing in your faith and your testimony so you can overcome. And
Yeah,
so
Elder
one
Holland did a good job on this, Tim. We should read more from that talk. Like he
we
really
should
did. Like he did really good. Like there's another passage like when go ahead and finish what you're saying. I feel like we should read it because
well
he gave an
yeah.
example of what you're describing. Like how do you respond to this?
Right. Yeah, go ahead and read that. And then I want to move to the next point of contention that we commonly receive as a criticism against our faith.
Okay, so closing on the Trinity topic and moving on to the next one, let's just leave Elder Holland's words. But he says that to those who believe in the Trinity, he says it's not our purpose to demean any person's belief nor the doctrine of any religion. We extend to all the same respect for their doctrine that we are asking for ours. So maybe we can ask ourselves, are we truly respecting their doctrine and asking that in return for us, or are we disrespecting their doctrine? So that
Right.
too is an article of our faith, he says. But if one says we are not Christians because we do not hold a fourth or fifth century view of the Godhead, then what of those first Christian saints, many of whom were eyewitnesses of the living Christ, who did not hold such a view either? We declare it is self evident from the scriptures that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are separate persons, three divine beings, noting such unequivocal illustrations as the Savior's great intercessory prayer just mentioned, his baptism at the hands of John, the experience on the Mount of Transfiguration, and the martyrdom of Stephen, to name just 4. So he goes and he gives some scriptural examples, and he just very, politely states, like, we see it in the scriptures. Here's where we see it. We respect the fact that you don't see it that way, but please respect the fact that we do, and don't disrespect us by saying that, we're not Christian, even though by definition, according to the scriptures, we are.
Right.
So,
Right. And that's good because the next point of contention that we often see, and these are and by no means in a priority or hierarchy, but these are just some of the common ones that we see. Of course, the mainstay one is Mormons aren't Christian because of da 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 da. The next sticking point is polygamy in early church history. So really, that comes down to the whole aspect of not understanding, and I think in recent times, following the conversations that even within our own faith tradition, this has become quite a sticky point, that in conversations that we see online is now you have the polygamy deniers, you have that whole movement there. You're familiar with that. And most of us are familiar with that, but from a standpoint of criticism, polygamy in early church history is often weaponized against us who are living in the here and now, in the present moment. And it's one of those things for me. It's one of those things that it's just like, I wasn't living during that time period. Um, the best I can do is understand it in its appropriate historical context, and then leave it lie where it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be in the past. Now, I have had an opportunity to do some actual interesting research on the reality of polygamy and evangelism. Believe it or not, this is a very problematic for even Christians in general, because we are commissioned to go and preach the gospel to all the world. Well, a few years ago, I came across an article and it's centered on the idea of how do we evangelize cultures that are steeped in political or polygamous traditions. And we're not just talking about a man marrying more than one wife. We're talking about the other aspect of polygamy. A woman. There are certain ethnic tribes of human beings that practice the other form of polygamy, where it's, instead of a man, it is a woman who is married to multiple husbands. And what they found happening is that when Christian missionaries were going into these areas and they're preaching the gospel, and they're preaching it to a guy who has 3 wives, and they have an established family. And it became such a concern that they're like, well, how do we fit this in with the message of the gospel? How do we fit this in and bring them into the relationship? And because what was happening was these ministers were saying, well, you can't believe in Jesus Christ because you're a polygamist. So you have to stay with one wife before you can become a Christian. So all of a sudden it becomes this, well, if you want to become a Christian, you have to abandon your traditions. You have to abandon this long held tradition. And that became problematic because they needed to address this. And so in Western culture, and this is where confirmation bias comes within a Western culture perspective, because we're demanding that another culture changes a long established tradition. Now, there could be some economical values. For me, when I came to understand polygamy in a historical context, number one, you're talking about a 19th century America, freshly, they're still growing. They're going through the growing pains, but women were basically property. They were the property of the husband. They couldn't own homes, they couldn't own land, they couldn't vote. So the rights and the privileges that women have today, even within the church, a lot of them did not have that. In essence, a lot of it was to that if their husbands were to pass away or something happened, they basically were shuttered. They were kicked out. So if they had nothing, they couldn't have anything to their name. And so they had to bring it. So when you think of the marriage, the father gives away the bride. And there's that transition, and I hate to say this term, that's the reality of it. It's a transactional process that happens with that. And so when we understand polygamy, we have to understand it in its historical context. And there may be a variety of reasons why it was established. Has it been abused? Most likely, yes, because humanity is humanity. People are going to do what people do, even the best intentions behind it. And we see that happen where even in ancient Israel, in the Hebrew people, one example would be the when Moses was commanded to take up a fiery serpent and put it up on the beam, which foreshadows and typifies of Christ being lifted up. And all they had to do was to look to that serpent that's on that cross, and then they'll receive their healing. Well, then they took it and they ran with it, and they used it to turn around and engage in idol worship, because it took their focuses off of God and it put it on that, and that became their God, so to speak. And so we have to understand that humanity is fallible. Humanity will do things. And I don't have to answer for Brigham Young. I don't have to answer for Joseph Smith. They have to answer for themselves, because that's not my life that I have to give an accounting for. What I have to give an account for is, am I willing to follow? And that brings up an interesting question. So what are your thoughts on that
I have so
with
many thoughts
polygamy and
on
church
this.
history?
You're not going to be able to have a short discussion with me on this. So instead of me addressing all of those things that you just said, first of all, I'm just going to say I have been working on a paper about marriage and family in the church for like, I don't know, the last 7 or 8 years, maybe almost 10. Because it started like back in 2015, I think. And it was when a friend of mine had sent me a link to, it was some anti-Mormon podcast. And it was
Mhm.
just really, really going after the church on Joseph Smith's polygamy. And I know now there's the whole viewpoint, even subcultures in the church that don't believe that Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage. So there's that too. At the time, back in 2015, the more, I guess you could say, popular attack was that it was Joseph's polygamy. Now there's this other shift where you see it's kind of falling on the feet of Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and John
Right.
Taylor, and not so much Joseph Smith. I think either way you look at it, maybe this isn't the best approach to history. So I concur with you on that. Now, I want to share, this is the one that I wanted to share my friend's quote. Okay. So my friend Abel, hi, Abel. He's like one of my favorite people. He is a man who has an amazing journey and story and a lot of spiritual wisdom and strength. And he's blind. He was born with glaucoma. He had a very powerful, miraculous conversion story. And when I say miraculous, I mean miraculous. Like there were some very beautiful miracles in his story. He's somebody who is a descendant of Lehi in his view. He's a Mexican. He's got a lot. He grew up in like East Los Angeles. He's got a lot of um, special feelings towards the idea of Lehi's posterity being gathered through the miracle of the Book of Mormon in the last days. So that's kind of like the context for where this is coming from. He's a very wise older man, and he told me this old Spanish adage that I think is really beautiful. And I don't really speak Spanish, even though I'm like half Mexican myself. But it's lo que no fue en tu año no es de tu daño. And he says it means what was done in your year is not for you to fear. What was done in the past, leave it in the past and move on. And I think this is a really good rule of thumb just in life in general. It's a very good principle. I feel like it applies here. I think one of the mistakes that we make, especially I'll see like really young people on like TikTok or YouTube or in different places on social media, they try to make a lot of excuses for plural marriage. My personal approach to this is not looking at it through the church history lens. I personally think that you can do this. You can spend a lot of time on this. I've done this. I've spent tons and tons of time digging into historical sources and trying to find primary sources. And I've read like all of Brian Hill's stuff, and I have my own personal feelings about it. But what really helped me with allowing myself to do what Abel counseled, which is to like not allow the past to cause fear for me. Was digging into the scriptures. And when I started studying this ancient covenant restored, just like President Nelson counsels us to do, the everlasting covenant, this is where I felt like I started to understand that the Lord has a very long view, and we have a very myopic view, to use President Nelson's words. And my view is much like Isaiah described, like the Lord's ways are not my ways are not the Lord's ways. And also, I think another thing that helped me was learning more about the infinite atonement of Jesus Christ. And I read that book, Infinite Atonement by Tad Collister, which is a really wonderful book. And I've read Jesus the Christ. You really get into atonement, I think, theology there. And then also with Bruce R. McConkie and his writings about the mortal Messiah. These things are really helpful because, you know, they kind of like when you look at this through like a covenant lens and like a covenant perspective, and then you also look at like the understanding of the people of the time, then it can really take some pressure off because you can be like, okay, do I need to worry about this? And as a woman, of course, I'm gonna be concerned about this, especially a modern woman in a day where, you know, this is so, I think, contrary to like how I would view marriage and family, or even like a feasible marital situation. I mean, marriage is hard enough with just two people. Imagine throwing someone else in the
Right.
mix, and I'm just like, holy moly. So, you know, I think for me, like my sensibilities, in order for me to set that aside and like get into the core doctrine, I have spent many, many years doing this. And one of the things that I've come to realize is dispensations and this everlasting covenant and the atonement and all of these things really factor in, I think, this priesthood covenant, the idea of like being a literal descendant and being entitled to priesthood and the promises of the last days and all of these things, they really kind of like play a part. And so I think you just got to study the gospel and not like get
Right.
hyper focused on one thing. And I don't know if this gives anyone some relief, but there's actually a really beautiful, at least I thought it was beautiful, just kind of quote and response from Elder Cook. It was in an article in July 2020, and it's called Church History, A Source of Strength and Inspiration. They in this he's with a couple of church historians. There's several comments pulled together, and it was from a discussion that they had. It was with Kate Holbrook. She was one of the historians. She has since died, I think, of cancer, but she was someone who studied women like in church history. They pulled together a lot of
Right.
comments, and they dealt with a lot of questions um, about church history and how people deal with it. Because you're right, like church history is a stumbling block. It's a stumbling block for us, for people within the faith, for people who are growing up in the church. It's a stumbling block, I think, for people accepting the gospel. Like you noted, one aspect is cultural traditions, but another can just be, you know, on the other end, like somebody who comes from like a more Western culture, it can also be a stumbling block because you're just like, wait a minute, how could this be part of God's plan or part of your past? And how could this church be true? And so
Right.
it can be a stumbling block for people to accept the gospel. And Elder Cook, he kind of approached it this way. And I think this is very simple. But he basically said that there are unanswered questions, but he said, I want you to know that we have a loving Heavenly Father who has a perfect plan, that his plan is one of happiness, and that we have a Savior who did everything for us. We can trust in them. And he also said in this exact same um, like article in the Ensign that he felt that it was like a consensus among the brethren. I was trying to find the exact quote, but he said that this had served its purpose, that it wasn't something that would come back, that it had served its purpose. So I'll see if I can find that quote, but But yeah, I was like, I think Abel's right. I think sometimes there's just certain things that we can't allow, like something that happened in the past to cause fear in us. You could do that about anything in history, really, because there's
Right.
so much, and we don't really know like all the things that people understood at the time. I mean, this was like a budding church. They were learning line upon line. Like there's just so much context that it's hard to really, I think, be the judge of the past. So I think President Oakes gave some really great counsel on this a long time ago too, and he gave that whole presentism talk, and he was just kind of like, we can't judge the past with like a presentism lens, because
Right.
we weren't there, and we don't understand what people were thinking, what they were understanding. And all we can do is like really study the scriptures, try to understand through the perspective of a covenant what people may have been thinking, and then to Abel's point,
Right.
let the past be in the past and not allow it to cause fear for us today. There's many things
Right.
that, like policies and practices, that we may question today, but may have been, not as questioned in the past, or maybe more acceptable in the past than they would be today. And I mean, this goes for a lot of things, and it's not even just this one thing. There's many, many things that people can attribute to a misunderstanding of scripture, or maybe to like a certain time that they lived in, or a historical context, that there's so much of that. And so I think that it's important to not get too judgy about the past through the presentism lens, and to not allow fear
Right.
to take over so that it destroys our faith in the Lord. Because if we understand the characteristics and attributes of God, then we should be able to understand that wherever mistakes have been made along the way in the past, we should be able to trust in the Lord that they can all be made right in the end. And if there's things we don't understand that are perfectly justified, the Lord can make that right too. He can help us understand someday and help us receive peace. Or, if we can't fully grasp a concept, or a policy or a teaching, then we can receive peace from the Lord that He's got this, that He's in control, and that it's
Right.
all going to be reconciled in the end, because He loves to restore and reconcile.
Well, and that's true. And yeah, the whole point of actually understanding is not so much of we again, it goes back to we want to be able to be positioned in a way to respond. And sometimes the best response is I don't really fully understand the reason, the mechanics behind this. It was practiced. Um, is there a possibility that it was abused? Most likely. I don't know. I can't speak to something I was not a part of. I can't speak to something that is in the past. All I can do is come to the best understanding I possibly can with that. And if you're going to use that to weaponize as to the reason that the church is wrong, then this gets into the conversation of how critics argue like atheists, because the same argument can be put into perspective of why did God allow slavery in ancient, why did God allow polygamy in ancient Israel, allow a lot of these things to happen in the biblical context. And so the argument loses its impact when we just say all we can do is come to the best understanding of it was a different people, it was a different culture, it was a different society. Thank goodness we don't have to live under that now.
Well, and there's
And I
agency in all of those things. Like, agency is a huge,
right.
like, divine law that God is always following. And I mean,
Right.
Quentin L. Cook, he basically boiled this down to like three main things. He was like, you need to look at like the fruits, right? Like the blessings that came from it, the negative things that
Right.
came from it, and kind of see, like, maybe, because you're right, there's some like bad fruits that I think came out of it. We can't overlook that. But there's also really good fruits that had come out of it. And so much
Right.
of this goes back to like the gospel and just having an understanding of the gospel. But just to make people feel better, especially you ladies out there, you can look this up. This is in the July 2020 church magazines. It's Church History, a Source of Strength and Learning. I don't want to lose this quote, so I'll look at the title in a second. But Quinn L. Cook said, in the senior councils of the church, there's a feeling that plural marriage, as it was practiced, served its purpose. We should honor those saints, but that purpose has been accomplished. So, whatever the purpose was for God authorizing this practice or allowing them to practice this, it served its purpose according to the senior councils of the church and Quentin L. Cook. So, you have that in the ensign. go find it if you want to save it. And I think it helps me to just not have the fear.
Right. And don't need to fear the past. And I think that's the biggest takeaway here for this. Now, the other sticky point is Book of Mormon authenticity. Now, I'm going to kind of put this into two because it's the Book of Authenticity and the archaeological evidence. So those are the two other common criticisms that we get. So regarding the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, claims of plagiarism from King James Bible, the claims of the Sam Balding theory, the claims of the view of the Hebrews, the claims of a book that was the idea of the Native Americans being descended from an ancient Israelite tribe, and that theory and that idea. Now, this is where I had some real deep study into. Now, the first thing is a lot of times when critics bring up, and even those who have left the church, that are now critical of the LDS faith, because I used to be one. I used to be one of those critics hitting the forums and hitting and they're wrong, and doing that whole gamut. So I've been on both sides of the fence, folks. So I haven't just been one-sided. I've been on both sides. So I'm speaking to my own experience here of being on the other side of being a apostate and critical of the church. But the Book of Mormon authenticity and the archaeological evidence, this was the one thing that actually brought me back to the church. And it happened by way of I was actually looking for ways to combat. I was heavily involved with Matt Slake's Christian apologetic research. I was in their forums and really going toe to toe with members of the church. And I was looking up information on how to prove that the Book of Mormon was fabricated by Joseph Smith. That was my whole intention. And I came across Pedro de Ciezo de Leon's Second Chronicles of Peru. I don't know how I came about it. I was sitting at the library and it just happened to come up on my Google search. I clicked it and thinking it's one thing, but then I was reading through it and I'm like, and I hadn't had it printed out. I took it home. I was reading through it. And then I ended up getting a copy of the Book of Mormon. It took me like 3 weeks just with that. If you're not familiar with Pedro de Ciezo de Leon and the Second Chronicles of Peru, in chapter 5, he talks about the touchings of Tika Veracota, who came to a place where it is where Lake Titicaca is on the border of Peru and Bolivia. There is a temple complex underwater there. Now, what he writes is not word for word, but what he writes is he says that things pertaining to before the Inca came into the land, and I'm paraphrasing here, that they describe this person that descended from the southern direction when they were offering prayers during a time of great darkness and mourning. And I had to open up Third Nephi and the passage that of Christ coming, the great catastrophic event. And then that launched me into studying volcanology of, okay, well, because the argument there is, when Christ was crucified, why does it say in the New Testament there was a great earthquake and 3 hours of darkness, but the Book of Mormon says that there was 3 days of darkness? Well, it launched me into studying volcanology, and here's where volcanology comes into play. If you look at every catastrophic volcanic eruption in recorded human history, Alaska, Krakatoa, even down in that South America area, one of the big the eruption of Vesuvius, written by Palladi the Younger, that it has caused 3 days of darkness. It has caused such changes that, in fact, one of the reasons that Joseph Smith and his family moved was because of a volcanic eruption that actually changed the farming and the agricultural aspect, because it devastated that. There is a time where they refer to a mini winter for a whole year, that it
It was
just
like a
literally
nuclear when
changes.
it was
Yeah,
the
it was almost
Tambora
like
volcano.
right. And so Krakatoa, for example, the last major eruption of Krakatoa, the blast itself was heard and felt over 3,000 miles. That would be like Mount Rainier, which is literally, I'm in Washington State, so I'm between Mount Rainier and Mount Baker, and then right in the very city we have Glacier Peak, which is a dormant volcano. So I'm surrounded by 3 dormant volcanoes. It would be Mount Rainier blowing up, if it blows, when it blows, and people not only feel it, but they hear it in New York City. That's how powerful Krakatoa's eruption was. They call these plenial eruptions, and it caused massive devastations. They literally changed the landscape. You go down. I remember taking a tour of Mount St. Helens. In that, you could see how I was standing on the ground that is now the ground, and there's a house that literally, which is not even a couple feet up from where the mud flows had settled, and so it does change landscapes. And my point being is that the very person that is describing Christ himself, had power over it, taught great things, taught everything that you'd expect the Savior to teach was what Pedro says, that this came by way of tradition and oral traditions, and even the ancient hymns, even before the Incas came into the world, of this. And that cinched it for me. That right there was the turning point of maybe I am wrong. And that was the humbling experience. Now, of course, it took me a few years later to make my way back to the church. But the very fact that the Book of Mormon authenticity and the archaeological evidence from silence, because they're trying to look at old world archaeology and then say, well, we don't have the same. Well, the reason we don't have the same evidence is because, one, you got the conquistadors, 2, you got the internal factors that records were destroyed, and 3, the New World archaeology didn't come into play until early 19th or late 19th, early 20th century, because a lot of focuses was on Egyptology and biblical archaeology and all that stuff. So you already have people associated, but you don't have the same level of evidence here because of that. And so when it comes up with these points, we have to recognize that people are typically coming from a place of silence. Just because that there's a lack of evidence doesn't mean that there is no evidence at all. And the best example I can give for that is mid 1990s. You walk into an astronomy class or talk to an astronomist and say, there are other solar systems out there. There are other Earth-like planets. They'll say, yeah, science fiction, buddy. And you'll be laughing out of the room. But since that, we have over documented 5 discoveries of exoplanetary and solar systems, rogue planets. And not only one, but a handful of potentially Earth-like planets
So,
that
Tim,
are comparable.
you're making good points and stuff, but I just want to make what I think is maybe even a better point, which is that no one's going to be able to show where the Book of Mormon took place. Nobody's going to be able
No,
to do that, not
no.
definitively. And so, to me, like, you can have theories about where it took place. All we've been told is that it was somewhere on the American continent. Now,
Right.
there's other ways that you can analyze the Book of Mormon to determine, just if there's any type of like authenticity or historicity there. I personally feel like if this is the path you want to go down, totally fine, totally get it. There's just better evidence. So, like the archaeological
Right.
evidence, anyone can just look at that and be like, "Well, you don't really know where it took place." So this doesn't really mean anything. Like a lot of times I see, especially on like Scripture Central, no offense to Scripture Central, love Scripture Central. In fact, I'm going to share some of their stuff here in a second, but the thing that I see is they're very committed to this Mesoamerica idea that it took place in Guatemala. I am fine with that. I don't mind that people think that. I don't believe that I am convinced that is where it took
Right.
place. I have my own reasons for that. Mostly it has a lot to do with like the covenants, the things that it says about the land that these people are occupying, and I have a harder time seeing it in terms of like what the language of the Book of Mormon is and the language of the covenants and kind of like what I'm seeing actually come to pass in the last days.
Right.
So I have a harder time, like, buying into the Guatemala thing. I think it's great that there's a lot of this like evidence that kind of ties in. I have no qualms with the idea that it could have been in North America, that it could have been in Central America, that it could be some both, that there's like there's some people who like bridge it and they're connecting it and they're like it's both. And I am open to all of those ideas. I don't really feel opposed to any of them. But to me, that's no evidence for the Book of Mormon. Like they have all these evidences on Scripture Central. I don't
Right.
see a lot of that as evidence to me that the Book of Mormon's authentic. I think it's a stretch. And the reason why I say that is because you don't know where it took place. And so I don't feel like that really holds up very well. I
Exactly.
personally feel like what does hold up, and to me, this is very, very convincing. But I think that for me, what has helped a lot to see how this is definitely not something Joseph Smith could have written is to look at some of the other evidences of Joseph Smith the prophet, like the Book of Enoch. There's tons of evidence there that this guy could not have written this stuff. And then there's also, like, within the Book of Mormon itself, a ton of textual evidence. So for those of you who are like really curious about these kinds of things, I would go that
Right.
route with it. If you're an apologist and you're like, hey, I want to get more into like Book of Mormon evidences, the literary devices that are at play, the Hebrew literary patterns of the Book of Mormon are replete.
Right.
We've got idioms, we've got adages being used, we have a lot of literary structures. Like, and when I say a literary structure, I'm not just talking about parallelisms and kind of the more
Mhm.
common things. Even like the chiasms that are in the Book of Mormon, these things weren't even discovered until like the 20th century. Okay, so these are things
Right.
that sometimes people are like, oh, well, that's just poetry and stuff like this. And it's like, well, if you really, if that's your response, then you really don't understand what you're talking about. Because if you look in the Book of Mormon, there are some where like the chiasm goes like chapters. There's one in Third Nephi. There's one in Moroni. So there's like several different like chapter long chiasms. And then just when you look at how Joseph Smith is said to have been, giving the transcription of the Book of Mormon, it's
Mhm.
not possible. And then I think too, like with his education level, this is not possible. I mean, we're talking about very, very complex writing styles that are ancient and that they're very consistent and that they all have like a central point and a central theme that follows the central theme of the Book of Mormon, which is another testament of Jesus Christ. And then there's also something that's really cool, which I happen to really like, which is the evidence of Jacob 5, the allegory of the olive trees. This is a
Mhm.
horticultural and allegorical or poetic masterpiece. I mean, this is something that somebody who's very gifted and talented wrote. And it doesn't even
Right.
appear to really fit in the context of the Book of Mormon in terms of like olive trees, because there's nothing else in the Book of Mormon where they're talking about olive trees or olives or that they even would have had this knowledge. So there's like a kind of like a connection back to ancient Israel just in the allegory itself. But then
Right.
in addition to that, it ties in with other like biblical motifs that are
Right.
Old Testament. And then on top of that, it's got the horticultural evidence is so much that John Welch actually has a book. I mean, it is like this thick. It's a thick book that's just on this one Book of Mormon evidence.
Right.
And then he's also done a ton on all the literary devices and literary structures that are at play that are like ancient. So I just think that there's better things to look at in terms of like evidence for the Book of Mormon that
Right.
it's just it's more solid, it's more it's more helpful if you're an apologist. So I don't know if that's
Right.
maybe the way to go, but for
Well,
me it has been.
one of the things that I fall back on, and this is more recent within the last year or two, is that whenever this criticism comes up about the Book of Mormon authenticity and whether or not there's archaeological evidence, it really comes down to where it shows they're showing their card as arguing from an atheistic perspective. And the reason why I say that is because how do atheists argue against the authenticity and reliability of the Bible? say, where's the evidence for these things? Not everything in the Bible has been confirmed by archaeological evidence. We don't know where the Ark of the Covenant is. All we know is could have been a mythical thing. There is mentioned this in our Come Follow Me when we talked about the book of Job. Is it oracle? Is it a pseudepigraphal work that was just inserted because of affinity to particular passages of scriptures? And so
I mean, I'm gonna
you
say
can't
no
just
on that one. I
you
think
well, I know.
there's tons of
Uh,
evidence Job is a fake person. God referred to him to Joseph Smith. Why would he be talking about a fake person? He was referred to
right,
as in connection with Daniel and Noah as a patriarch in Ezekiel. I mean, I think it was a real person, but could his story be allegorical and typological? Could it have been
right.
written as an
Well,
allegory or a poetry to teach something? Yeah,
yeah.
totally.
Well, and yeah, and appreciate that, because that speaks to the reality of how people approach this idea and conversation. And really, it just comes down to, and I ask critics when they bring up the authenticity of the Book of Mormon and archaeological evidence, I said, what if there's no evidence to support anything within the Bible? What if there's nothing that pairs to authenticate? You don't have documentary evidences, you don't have historical sites, you don't have anything. You just have the Bible for what it is. Are you willing to follow that Bible for what it is without logical evidence?
Well, Tim, for a
Because
long
I
time, there
think the
wasn't a
trapping,
lot of evidence.
and for a long time, there wasn't a lot of evidence.
A lot of
Right.
that's come
And I
out
think
in the
that's the
20th
trapping.
century.
Right. And that's the trapping, because if you have evidence, then where is faith? And the best thing is when Thomas is informed that Christ was resurrected. And I don't think it was that he was just in the state of being antagonistic. He's just like, well, I want to know for myself. You guys seen him. So if you've seen him, then why can't I see him? And so it was more of that genuineness. And then Christ appears to him. And then what did Christ say to him? He says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. So
Mhm.
faith is not based on, if you're saying that in order for me to believe, I have to have evidence.
Well,
Well,
then you're
faith is
just putting yourself in a really bad position come judgment day, so be careful.
right, right.
You make it
And
really
so,
hard on yourself and you don't have to.
right. So so we have to be careful when that. What's the best answer to that criticism, though, about the article? Is say, well, you know what? We don't know. And we do know that there is evidence coming forth. We do know that there are possibilities. There are that we can't deny. And the thing that I usually say is that if what is presented in a court of law, it would be considered as circumstantial evidence
Mhm.
um,
Well,
of the
except for the textual
possibility.
analysis, and that's why I say
Except,
I would set aside the geography thing. I would not even go
right.
there or even the DNA thing because I think it's very shaky ground. I personally think if you were to go to a court of law, your best
Mhm.
Book of Mormon evidence is the text itself. It is in the text
Right.
itself. And if you are an apologist for or somebody who just wants to evangelize for the church, look at it from that perspective. Like, no joke, go look at what John Welch wrote on
Right.
all of the literary structures on Jacob 5 because there is some really amazing just things that are like impossible. I'm sorry, it is impossible for Joseph Smith to have written this. It is
Mhm.
impossible. They've done analysis on like how many voices come across in the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith would
Right.
have to be like not just like a genius, but like a miraculous genius to have been able to write better than all of the greatest writers on the planet, to be able to be so consistent. And I mean, just the cross references alone are amazing. So I would say set that
Right.
aside, forget about it, don't even worry about it. Focus on what's there, what's in the text itself in terms of how the text is structured and organized, and just allow that to speak to you and to be a witness of Jesus Christ, that this is truly another
Right.
testament of Jesus Christ. So there's a couple questions though that I think maybe are worth
Yeah, so I was
answering.
looking at that. So I don't know which one was first. I think Doubting Thomas one, an important question that Jessica or Tim might help me with. How are we to understand that the age of miracles, time of Christ and earlier, was from a pre-scientific time, whereas they're now so rare. Well, I don't think that they're as rare as want to make them out to be. I think miracles happen every day. We may not recognize them. Now, are you talking about the miracles of, you know,
So I have
uh
one for you on this, Tim. Can I respond to
okay.
this? Because I was thinking about this while you were talking, and that's why I was saying I think we should answer this question. So, first of all, people say, oh, there were all these miracles in the Bible. Okay, there's a handful of miracles in the Bible, but
Right.
who actually knew about those miracles and witnessed them? Not very many people. A very, very, very small number of people even knew about Moses and the Red Sea. And really the only people who
Mhm.
continued to know about it were the ancient Israelites. They kept telling the story over and over again, long after it had been forgotten by any of the Egyptians. So I think that sometimes we look at the Bible and we give it some kind of like, I don't know, prestige in terms of like all these miracles, and we're not being realistic in our approach, because first of all, these were hundreds of years apart, most of these miracles in the Bible. And then even in the time of Jesus Christ, it's like one or two people, maybe the disciples around Jesus Christ, even witnessed the miracles, and we're getting them all through the apostles who recorded the gospels, because those were the people who were there and saw it, but the rest of the world did not see those miracles. And so if you think about it from just being logical and realistic in terms of who actually saw these things, the only reason we even know about it is because prophets wrote about it, and they were mostly the ones
Right.
who had witnessed it and seen it. So a very small few people in the earth even witnessed any of these miracles, and a very small number of people even told about them for generations to come. They were spaced out over a lot of time. Now, in terms of modern miracles, so there was a second part to this question. It was current
Yeah.
proposed miracles of today are conveniently not verifiable sufficiently by scientific consensus. Okay, first of all, would it be a miracle if it was verified by scientific consensus? I don't know. I don't know if it would be. I think that would be science. And then also, and yes, it's true, the Pharisees saw Jesus raise a man from the dead, but again, small number of people compared to the
Now,
whole world. Like, how many people actually
yeah.
knew? So then think about all the miracles that are told at General Conference, and you may or may not know this, but if you look in the Gospel Library on the church website, there's
Mhm.
miracle after miracle after miracle told just in the modern church history, from the pioneer time of Joseph Smith
Right.
all the way up through to today. Like literal miracles where people are raised from the dead, where people come back from the dead. They have near death experiences and come back. They are healed through powers of the priesthood. They
Right.
like, there's just so many. There's been times where, like, I have a friend of mine who actually was in a car accident, total miraculous story that she told. I personally have experienced miracles in my own life, things that I know. It's like you
Right.
cannot explain how you survived something or how something happened, and you're still here. And it's like, I mean, there's just so many miracles. So to say
Right.
that there's not is not really true. In fact, my friend Jared from Christian Homestead, he has a channel on YouTube. It's called Christian Homestead, and he has a spreadsheet that he puts in the link of or puts the link in the description of all of his videos. And it's mostly on the second coming, because that's his little niche that he focuses on. But he has a tab on there where he started recording miracles in church history. And so when he finds like a miraculous story, or things where there's visitations from angelic beings or people from the spirit world, he's recording it on the spreadsheet, like collecting all the data. And it's really cool
Right.
because you can see that this happens a lot. And this is just in 200 years, like since the church began, that these miracles happen. And again, if you look through just the Gospel Library app, you'll find so many stories where people are viewing this as miracles, and some of them really truly seem to be miracles. It's hard to explain how, somebody can survive
Right.
something or something can happen.
Well,
So I would say don't count miracles out. They do happen. Just because you're not aware of it, or just because it seems like
yeah.
they're all compiled together in the Bible. If you look at my friend's spreadsheet, like there's a lot of these. If you look in the Gospel Library app
Mm.
specifically for miracles, you'll find a lot of them. You may even find more than what's recorded in the Bible, because
Right.
and they're closer together. They're in like a modern era of just the last 200 years.
Well, and the thing about miracles is that I've come to understand is that they're very personal. There's not very many people around, so unless you have intimate understanding and actually witness a miracle, a lot of times we hear the folk miracles that we hear, the three Nephites coming and saving the day kind of thing.
The seagulls
It,
and the
the,
crickets.
the seagull, yeah. So we have to understand that when somebody shares a miracle that actually happened to them and it's real, it's valid, it's authentic, well, it's that old telephone game. They tell somebody that somebody passes it on to other people, and pretty soon, by the time it gets down, the 10th, 11th, 12th person, the stories changed, the names changed, the miracle itself changed. And so it's not to say that the miracle didn't happen. It's just we have to. This is where again discernment comes into play, where we just have to sometimes take things with a grain of salt, because there may be something more underlying it, that we may not understand. So unless we have it, however, on the flip side, I do have to say probably the greatest miracles I've seen involve somebody coming from a place of despondence, despair, hopelessness. They're at the end of their rope. They're in a place of darkness. They're caught up in the grips and the throes of addiction. And then they finally come into faith and they're converted. They start believing in Christ. They start changing their lives. Their lives start transforming. If you want to see a true miracle, and that there is actual scientific evidence for, look at the before and after pictures. Takes a photo of them in the throes of their addiction, and the 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years. That is probably the biggest evidence that miracles still happen today. And so that's what I want to point out. Now, Kobus says, is there prophecies in the Book of Mormon? Yes. You count all the
Yes, there's
Messianic
tons.
prophecies. You count all the prophecies, because the Book of Mormon was really written for our time to warn us of what is to come, so we can be prepared to stand firm in the testimony and reality of who Jesus Christ is. And I don't think we need to go
The Book of
into
Mormon itself,
have a
the
deep
entire
dive.
thing is a prophecy. Like in
Right,
fact, if you want like an illustration of that, I think it's Joseph Smith Foundation, and they have like it's like a little card, like a little you can order it as like a card or a poster, and what it does is it shows the timeline, like the Book of Mormon timeline, and like all the parallels from like the start of the Reformation period that preceded Joseph
right,
Smith and his lifetime, like the time of the American nation being set up, all the way through to the millennium, and it just shows how the Book of Mormon is giving. Again, this is a literary structure that shows how there's a prophecy in the Book of Mormon that's basically like um, it sets up a structure that is something that is supposed to repeat in the end time, in the last days, from the time
right,
of the Reformation through to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And the prophecies about Jesus Christ's second coming are very much allegorical. One of the chiasms in the Book of Mormon, I want to say this is third Nephi, and it's in one of the 20 chapters. So let me see if I can find it, because I can't remember the exact chapters. I may have to just like put it, I don't know, like in a comment later on the video, but it's somewhere in there. And I have a
right.
ton of notes on this, but there's two chapters in the middle of, is it third Nephi? I'm pretty sure it's third Nephi. And it's like the two chapters are chiasms. Yes, twin chiasms. So it's third Nephi chapter 20 through 21. These are twin chiasms. These are a prophecy about the end time, and basically the gathering of Israel, and that happening through the Gentiles who, or like the tribe of Ephraim that got like mingled, like the northern kingdom when it got conquered anciently by Assyria, and then it got scattered. How in the last days
Right.
Ephraim receives the gospel, and then starts gathering these lost tribes, and then they gather the original house of Israel. So that's kind of what it's about. It's about the gathering of Israel. And Jesus Christ is like at the center of this chiasm. So this goes across chapters 20 and 21 of third Nephi. And this is a very complex literary structure, very, very
Right.
complex. And it is a prophecy in and of itself. And then also, if you look at First Nephi, he prophesies like Columbus. He prophesies basically the whole Reformation period, the establishment of a nation. He prophesies like the Gentiles again. The Ephraimite Gentiles is what it's talking about, like the tribes that had gotten scattered and mingled as Gentiles and lost their identity and identified with the Gentiles. It talks about
Right.
them in, I believe it is starting, is it First Nephi 14? Or I think it's 13. No, it's 12. Yeah, so it's after the tree of life, where he sees the tree of life. So it's like starting about chapter 12, and it goes through about chapter like 15 or 16. Looks like maybe 16 of First Nephi. And this is an end time prophecy about the Book of Mormon coming forward, about I mean, you read it and it's literally talking about Columbus and the founding fathers. Like, that's what it's talking about. And so there are prophecies in the Book of Mormon. There's more than that. Those are just a couple. There's probably some of the more interesting ones that have to do
Right.
with the second coming.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, and there's layers of prophecies with that.
Well, there's allegorical ones too. There's tons of
right.
those, but
There's
the other
allegorical
ones
ones.
are like not just the other ones are not just
So,
allegory. They're like just very literal prophecies.
right. Um, the fifth common criticism that we get is centers on the first vision account. So it's a lot of critics will typically first they'll deny that it ever happened. Then when it's they'll admit, okay, so there's the possibility that he claims it, but it's not what they want us to believe it is, because it says they argue, well, there's in it, and they use it to discredit Joseph Smith because they can't deny the reality that it did happen. They'll admit that something did happen, but they'll say that it was because it was a false angel, or it was a demon and not an actual angel, or that he contradicted himself. And that's such an easy criticism to dismantle. All we have to do is look at the three separate accounts that Paul gives with regards to his experience on the road to Damascus. In that line of logic, and this really comes down to the other issue, is that when you start responding to these critics online, you're using their arguments against them, uh, because they don't want to hold themselves to the same standard that they're holding us to. They'll want us to investigate. They'll want us to look at their claims. They're not willing to actually come to the table and look at their claims too as well. And so they'll either fall to, well, that's what aboutism. We're not talking about Paul, or they'll say, well, you don't understand. It's like, well, that's the point I'm making, is that you don't understand. And so they attack the variations of the first vision accounts. The other thing that I think is on par with the same level of the polygamy and history of the church is priesthood ban and race. The historical policies framed as proof of racism. Again, that's one of those things that you have to understand 19th century Christianity and 19th century America at the time, that this was actually an issue within that framework. And I have an article that I published. I think I'm going to turn it into PowerPoint presentation to address this, but I think it's just, again, it's one of those things that we just don't have an insight and understanding. We can only look at it after the fact to kind of determine. For me, though, is that even if you take Joseph Smith out of the picture, even if there was no Latter-day Saint faith, there was no restoration, there's no book, racism was prominent within colonial America. And I think that's the point people miss, because the idea of the curse of Ham, the idea of the curse of Cain, did not come from Latter-day Saint teaching. It did not just show up on the scene in a vacuum where all of a sudden, here it is, here's the band. We're not going to. No, it has already been there because it was part of the economic structure within the antebellum South, and holding to that, they literally used the Bible to show that slavery was the purpose and will of God. And so if you want to argue racism within the LDS faith, you have to then argue racism within American Christianity. You cannot separate the two. You can't say we're at fault for promoting racist ideas and the priesthood ban and then negate addressing the actual context of where that developed, because people were coming in from different faiths. They
Well,
were coming in
that's
from
true. That's true for everything in the church. That's what I was trying to say earlier, where it's like you got to take off the presentism lens because it's true for
right.
everything in the church. It's like they were really a lot of things have changed, policy wise, but the
Yeah.
structure, the organization, the keys, like all of those things, those have not. Like policies change, but like the core doctrine doesn't. And I have like this little diagram that is helpful to me for studying. And one of the things I think is important, Tim, is when you're studying, think in terms of core doctrine, like try to understand core principles. Like Joseph Smith said, I teach them true principles and then they govern themselves. This is an important
Right.
part of agency, and it's how God works with his people. He did this with the children of Israel too anciently. God has
Right.
authorized or accepted a lot of people into the covenant under circumstances that would normally be considered abominations, or they would be cut off
Right.
from the covenant. And you see this a lot in the Old
Right.
Testament. So I think that, we have to kind of take off the judgment lens and just try to come
Right.
at it from like, if I was God and I'm working with a people in this situation, what is the way that I can find the balance between agency and just kind of like helping them ascend, like get on that path of ascension and um be less judgmental, try to be more like try
Right.
to think like God.
Well, my takeaway and how I always respond to that I came out of the study of the priesthood ban and race is the reality is you're in antebellum South. It's steeped in slavery. It's steeped in the idea that the Bible promotes slavery, that it's okay to put people in a position of oppressing them and enslaving because the Bible says so, and we're the superior race is their argument is. Now imagine you're in antebellum South. It's 19th century America. It's the 1800s. And you have this new church. Joseph Smith is at the helm of the new church, this new religious movement. And all of a sudden, you're converted into the faith. You're a slave. You're a slave owner, and you walk into church, and the person who's in authority over you is a bishop who is an African American descent. That would not happen. That would not happen at all. And I think the reason why that I've come away to understand is that the culture and society at that time was not ready to embrace what we have now because of the civil rights movement, because of the constant
See,
movement.
and I would even
And
refrain from doing that
unfortunately,
as an apologist, Tim. The reason why I would refrain from it is because we've actually been counseled not to do that. We've been counseled by prophets and
oh, okay.
apostles not to try to come up with reasons or answers to something that we don't know. And
Well,
I
I'm just saying for me, that's how I've resolved
Yeah, and I think on a
the
personal
that's how I
level,
resolved the
like, on
debate.
a personal level, like, it's okay to, like, do stuff like that, but what I would do is refrain from as an apologist, like, if you're defending the faith, I would refrain from making excuses or trying to come up with
Right,
reasons, because one thing that's happening in scholarship right now is people are kinda dumping right now on Brigham Young and saying things like, "Oh, polygamy is his fault," or "The bad part of it was his
right,
fault," or all these things, and then same with race and the priesthood, they're like, "Hey, Brigham Young,
right,
we don't have a revelation, we don't have this," and it's like, we don't know that we have one, like, we don't have a record of one,
right,
we don't know why they didn't change it for 150 years,
right,
like, we don't know for sure why, but we do know that people asked, and, like, we know what we know some facts, but we don't have the full story and the big picture, and Spencer W. Kimball, mind you, was the one who actually reversed this policy in his day, even though
mhm,
prior prophets had counseled on this and they felt like it was coming, but it wasn't the time, was kind of the conclusion of that or the outcome of it for whatever reason. There's no reasons given. And I think that we err when we
right,
are trying to make up reasons or make up excuses. And you see that with the curse of Ham and the curse of Cain thing, like
right,
preserved through Ham. Like this is one of those like reasons that came up that people were trying to put words in the prophet's mouths and in God's mouth and come up with reasons. So I think we do better to not answer questions that we do not actually have an answer to. I think it's safer and
right,
maybe more true to our faith and maybe even as an apologist to say, you know what, we don't actually have an answer to this. This is still one
Yeah.
of the questions that we're trying to wait on
Right.
an answer. So we're waiting patiently on the Lord. Now, there's lots of things you can do there too. You can look at it doctrinally from like a perspective of what do the scriptures say, what was going on
Right.
at the time, like historically. So all of those things, it's the same thing. It's like you kind of have to, you really have to be careful, I guess is what I'm saying, not to be putting words in the prophet's mouth and not to teach people, especially
Right.
when you're talking to people not of our faith. It is best not to give your opinion. It is especially if
Right.
you're talking to people who are not of the faith, because they are not going to understand that that's your opinion.
Right.
They are not going to have the full context of where that information that you've concluded on is coming
Right.
from. So it's more, I think it's very, very important if you're an apologist or if you're an evangelist for the church to not tread into a territory that you're not authorized to do.
Right. And that's some really good points, and I appreciate the correction there. Um, because yeah,
I'm
like I
not
said,
trying
for
to
me,
correct
that's
you.
how I came. I know,
I'm
I
not
know.
trying to correct you. I'm
I'm
just
just
trying to prevent like a spiral of like all another onslaught of questions
onslaught of yeah.
for
I
something
get it. I
for
get that.
something that is really actually your opinion, right? It's like
It
your opinion. It
it's
is not
how
gospel doctrine. We
I've
don't
come
have
away
answers.
to yeah. It's how I've come to understand it for myself to make sense in my own mind. But when it comes up, I basically yeah, like you said, I really don't know. We weren't part of. Don't know exactly what's happening behind it. Rationalize it all day long. I can come up with any number of excuses as to the possibilities, but the reality at the end of the day is we just don't know. And you're right
And
that
that's
it is one
okay.
of
You
those
can
things
have it
that
be an open book on your table, right? Like you can still be studying
right.
it. It's an ongoing
It's an
restoration and
ongoing
it's an
thing. Right.
ongoing process.
Right. And we may not know. We may not have a valid answer, but the reality is that, again, how do we address that? How do we, when it comes up and they want to press it, is because I don't speak for the church. I speak for myself. I speak for what I know and I understand. And if it's beyond my pay grade, if it's beyond my level of understanding, I'm not going to speak to it because, yeah, you're right. That's when we are walking thin ice. And every time you walk on thin ice, eventually that ice is going to cave in and you're going to just fall into that icy cold water and you don't know where you're going to go and you're going to be floundering. And
Well, and
so, yeah, it's a good
I think
idea
it
to
creates
just say,
contention maybe where we don't need it. Because
we
if you're
unintentionally create tension where we don't need to
yeah,
create contention.
yes. Yeah.
All right. So I think this is the biggest thing right now we see in modern history. It reared its head in the early 80s, and I think it has reared its head in the last few years, and that's women in the priesthood authority. Now, you've done a lot of study on this. So there's accusations of inequality. So Jessica, her channel is Christ Pearls. She has done a lot of studying on this. There's a book she always recommends. Book.
Yeah, it's the one by Barbara Morgan Gardner, and it's called The Priesthood Power of Women. It's my favorite book, and it actually is pretty cheap too. I think you can get it for like 10 bucks, the ebook. It's
Yeah.
totally worth having. She has some diagrams in there. She gives a history of the priesthood from Adam down to Joseph Smith and how it's changed, like the structure of how like the gospel covenant goes forth is kind of it's adapted from dispensation to dispensation. And again, it's a really beautiful story to me because it shows how God
Right.
works with his people and how he adapts based on where we're at. He kind of meets us where we are. He's constantly trying to bring us into the covenant based on our understanding. And I love this because to me, this
Right.
is a testimony of Jesus Christ and kind of like a balance between the law of justice and mercy, where it's like, the Lord is not going to hold us accountable for things that we don't understand. He holds us accountable for what we
Right.
do understand. And then he
And
allows us
what
to
we're going to
operate and sort of like progress in our understanding as we go.
right.
So what
But
did you want
yeah,
to talk about
that's
on
a
that?
sticky. Well, no, I just want to mention that because I know we're getting up to the 3 hour mark here because this is, I
Well, we
wanted
get a
other
lot of
people to come
criticism
in.
apparently, huh? It
Right.
can take this long.
But yeah, yeah, a lot of these are some, that's one that we can explore very in an actual. That would be one that I would love to have a conversation on where we can have a balanced panel of discussion, men, women, and how do we see women, how priesthood authority, and all of that within that ideal, because we don't see it as an inequality. We see it as a we see it within the nature of equity, that we have our defined. This gets into gender roles, the specific gender roles of, the purpose of men and the purpose of women, and relationship to the covenants, and in relationship to the nature of man shall not be left alone, um, that man is not meant to be alone, that Eve was brought to him face to face, that we come face to face to each other, that we are I hate the term, but it is complementarianism. um and even within Christianity, you have that debate of complementarianism or egalitarianism. And that's a conversation I don't want to have, but sometimes we tend to tiptoe into the tulips of that conversation. But really getting to understand, you have a very unique perspective on the different roles for women and men when it comes to the priesthood, and how that operates, and how that works within the dynamics of that relationship, within the covenants, within the family, and within the salvific ordinances. And so that would be something that would be a good to have on a later date
For the
with a
purpose
good
of this
panel.
discussion, I would just refer to like the family proclamation. This is doctrine. We've been told this many, many
Right.
times. It's doctrine. It's unchanging. It's actually listed. There's on the church website, we have like the 9 basic core doctrines that are unchanging and eternal. If you just go to the gospel library or to the church website and you just type in basic doctrines, it should pull up. And what it is it's the 9 core doctrines that are unchanging. Sometimes people are like, well, your church is always changing. And it's like, well, policies change. Yeah, but the core doctrines, those have
Right.
remained the same from the beginning. The family proclamation is actually cited there. It's referenced there as an illustration of the core doctrine on the family. And so
Right.
this is like our brethren acknowledging that this is a core doctrine. And so for those
Right.
dissenters who want to say it's not, I'm sorry, they posted it under the basic core doctrines. So that's how I interpret it. That's what Elder Rasband just said in the last general conference. So I don't know. It's core doctrine, and it says something very important about men and women. It explains what the purpose of the father role is, the purpose of the mother role, how these two things make up God. So you can't have a God the Father without a mother, right? Like he's not a father
Right.
if there's not a mother. And so it's kind of rooted in these sort of basic simplistic ideas that we're all familiar with. And it's very clear on this is eternal. We have
And I
heavenly
think,
parents.
yeah, I think Jasmine Rappley, is that her name? Is that how you pronounce her
Mhm.
name? Rappley, Neil Rappley, and Jasmine Rappley actually did a really good episode on her channel, in relationship to this topic of discussion too. So check her channel out. They also just started Informed Saints, which is a really good channel to subscribe to, and everything else like that. The next one is Temple Secrecy. That's a long-standing one too. Is, it's portrayed as cult-like or exclusionary,
It's
and
not
it's
that
secret and
secret.
sacred. It's not that secret.
It's not that
Well,
secret.
it used to be, prior to the internet. It actually used to be very
Now with the
secretive.
internet, it's definitely not secret,
But
but
with
even before.
people pretty much, thanks to the detractors and certain nefarious individuals, who have taken unauthorized video footage of actual temple rituals. But again, temple secrecy, it's portrayed as cult-like or exclusionary. But it goes back to the reality that who was only allowed into the temple? The high priest, the sons of the sons of Aaron. They were the only ones that were allowed to. And who was allowed into the Holy of Holies? Only one high priest was allowed into the Holy of Holies. And so it's not so much that it's secretive, it is because it is. And it for me, it really comes down to the whole adage of, when you have too many chefs in the kitchen, it causes chaos. Each
For me,
person
what it
has
comes
a defined
well, I was gonna
has a
say for me,
defined
it
way
comes
of.
down to just like it's not because it's sacred. It's not like we're trying to exclude anyone, but like think about the idea of like, I don't know, like the word apocalypse, like John the Revelator who wrote this revelation, right?
Right. Hidden.
Hidden. And then there's an unveiling
Yes.
of truth and knowledge. That's what the temple
Right.
is. In fact, just a fun thing to note. Side note here, John the Revelator's vision of the seven seals is the temple drama. It is a temple text. Like
Is
it takes you through the entire plan of salvation,
right.
the purpose, and then what it all builds up to. This is the temple drama. And there's like you can literally divide it up and you can find all 5 covenants that you make in the temple. You can find wording like temple language, temple symbolism in it. It's pretty amazing.
Right. The I'm going to kind of pivot here because the last one is works versus grace. That's another common one, which misrepresents LDS doctrine as work-based salvation. They usually Second Nephi 25:23, Ephesians 2:8-9. They usually use that as a proof text. They don't understand how we view grace, how it relates to works, and so I think it just comes down to that they view that we are still subject to the law of Moses, and they're not able to wrap their minds around the idea that, in fact, Paul called it the law of grace, that he refers to grace as a law, and that there are certain ordinances to that. In Galatians, he refers to living out the law of Christ. And so there's this idea that there is a nature of obedience to the teachings and ordinances of the gospel as they are laid out and respect to that. And that doesn't mean that we do everything and then God's grace kicks in. It's that his grace is sufficient where we're weak. He makes us strong in relationship to that. And I mean that's pretty much an ongoing argument. That's a pretty much ongoing conversation we have with that. And I think the last one is the most recent one within the last year, couple years, especially within the last year, and that's financial transparency, criticisms of church wealth, and tithing, and the ongoing lawsuit of people who are trying to get back the church to pay back all the money they paid into for tithing, tithes, and offerings, and they're suing the church for that, and they're trying
Yeah.
to
And they
get the
lost.
Supreme Court.
They lost.
Well, no, they're actually trying to get the Supreme Court to take the case on.
They are, but
So the
I think
petition
that
of
the
the Supreme
Supreme
Court,
Court's probably going to uphold the lower court's decisions, assuming they even take it, because they've done
right?
multiple of these and they've all kind of fizzled out. So I'm not worried about it at all. I think that this is really disgusting that anyone would be like, I want my charity back. And it's just like, come on. Are you kidding me? And I don't know. I don't have a high opinion of people who would even bother to do something like that. I mean, just the I don't know, like the pride level, the arrogance, the lack
Right.
of charity is just like astounding to me. And the selfishness and self-righteousness too of that type of lawsuit is just like, oh my goodness, don't even get me started. Isaiah prophesied it, you guys. Read Isaiah.
Well, the only thing I'm going to say to this is that it's going to set a very dangerous. If in the event that they do win, I don't think people realize what door that's going to open up, because now anybody can sue any nonprofit organization that they made a financial contribution to.
But
So that
they're
means
not
that it's
gonna
the
do
door
that.
for people.
They're not gonna do that, and I'll tell you why. It's because
Well,
of politics, because think about how
right,
many donors there are to, like, any type of conservative or liberal movement, and, you know, if
right.
somebody were to be like, "Well, you scammed me," or "I don't agree. I feel like you misrepresented," and then people could start suing for it back, it would create chaos in the country, so I just don't think that that's
Exactly.
gonna happen, and that's why I'm not worried about it, because there's too many greedy politicians out there and too many other greedy 501(c)(3)s that really are more greedy and, like, self-serving that wouldn't wanna lose their money, so I think the church is
Right.
probably gonna be fine on that, but, I mean, if that did happen, it would surprise me. If it did, I would look at it as a sign of the end times. I don't think it will, just because, like I said, there's a lot of organizations out there that are highly questionable that do take money and take donations, and they would be at risk.
Well, I mean, look at the issue surrounding the GoFundMe campaigns of what's been happening and how that's been misused. You know, the church is being. I don't think people really understand the history behind tithing. That at one point, the church was actually in severe financial debt. And one of the things, and I think it was it under Brigham Young, or who was the one that instituted
No, this
to
was
where
something
it
we just
was a
covered
movement
recently in
to
the
bring
Come
the church
Follow
out of
Me.
right.
This was
And so
recently
there was
covered
a
in the Come
movement to
Follow
get
Me, and God gave a revelation to Joseph Smith, and tithing was part of that, like how they were going to be able to support the church and sustain its mission.
right. And so yeah, so that one. So um 3 hours. This is a definite needed conversation. This is probably an ongoing conversation. I was wishing we had more people here to have this conversation. However, now given the fact that it's just you and I having this conversation for the last 3 hours, I think it's good that it was just us, because it could have been a marathon conversation that we would have probably had to do a part 2 and a part 3 for that. But,
Yeah,
any
I think it was
final
fine. We
thoughts
got
on
through
this?
all of it.
Any words of
I think in terms of apologetics, I personally don't like that word. I don't use it. I don't consider myself an apologist. I'm not somebody who's like out there like, "Oh, I need to defend the faith and I need to go get in arguments with a bunch of people." And I am somebody though who has a testimony of Jesus Christ, and this church, I see it as the restored church of Jesus Christ, and I see it as the vehicle for administering this ancient covenant in the last days. I see the church as being a foster father and a nursing mother to the house of Israel, to gather the house of Israel. And I see the gathering of Israel as being the great event that precedes the second coming of Jesus Christ. And it happens against a backdrop of persecution and bigotry and war. And so I feel like we're in the right place. I have a testimony of the church that through my own experiences, I feel like the Lord has testified to me time and time again that this is where He wants me to be and this is where He needs me to be. And I am perfectly happy with people who don't feel the same way, that they don't feel like that's where they're supposed to be. They don't have that same testimony. And the reason why is because I trust Jesus Christ. I believe that we are the marvelous work and wonder, like Elder Bednar recently said. I don't see the Book of Mormon as being the marvelous work and wonder. I know it's sometimes been called that. I think that's just one of the tools through which the true marvelous work and wonder is going to take place, which is that great gathering of God's people into the covenant relationship with Him and back into the family of God. And I feel like because I have that testimony, I have an obligation and a responsibility to share it, especially with people who really want to know and to hear it and to
mhm,
understand what I understand. And I don't really feel very obligated to the ones who don't. I feel like, well, they're just not ready for it. And I don't believe in like forcing people to accept something that they're not ready to receive. It's the idea of like casting pearls
right.
before swine is an important one to me. And I just feel like I feel like it's okay because the Lord, He really truly is at the helm. And I think that the Lord, I see all the churches on the earth, including the non-Christian ones, as having some
Mhm,
value for the most part. And I would say maybe there's a couple of exceptions to that, but for the most part, I see some value in all of these different religious cultures and beliefs that exist throughout the earth, particularly those that are more aligned with what I see as the true doctrine of Jesus Christ. But even those that don't, I mean, if you look at the prophecies in the scripture, particularly in Isaiah and in the book of Revelation, I feel like the message is that God, He's aware of all of us. He knows who we are, and he knows how to gather his people. And one of the comforts that I find in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is actually the doctrine of the temple and the work that we do for the dead. I see that as something literal. I don't see that as like a figurative thing in the New Testament in Corinthians. I see that as, nope, this is part of the doctrine of Christ, and a true church needs to have that. It needs to have prophets, seers, and revelators, 12 apostles. It needs to be similar to that same organization that existed in the primitive church. I see that there was a need for a restoration. These are all the things that I've just come to know and feel like I've had a witness of. And I feel like, if people have questions about that, I'm happy to just talk about it and just say, hey, this is why I think it. This is
Right.
where I found it. This is how it feels to me. And if it doesn't feel that way to someone else, I'm perfectly fine, because I trust the Lord that he knows what to do with his child, his son or daughter, his brother or
Right.
sister, however you want to view Jesus Christ. I view us as his sons and daughters. We're adopted sons and daughters unto Christ in our view with the Godhead. But, if you view that as he's God the Father, he's a Trinity, I think either way it works, because we're all part of that covenant with Jesus Christ. And whether we see him as being like an adopted father unto us, or like our literal father, or we're creations that he created, I think either way, the Lord can meet us where we are, and he knows how to save his children. He knows how to save us.
Yeah. I think for me, it just comes down to, and didn't talk about this, but it just came to my mind, and I just want to close out with this. Yeah, I see that we are in the process of gathering all of the house of Israel. The salvific ordinances are doing that. The restoration of the gospel is doing that, and I am doing I'm doing a 36 episode channel on the apostasy to restoration, reformation or restoration. That's the question. So I'm going to probably have that coming up here in the next few days. But check out Jessica's channel, Christ Pearls. And my final thought is this: that a lot of times we as Latter-day Saints get accused of cowering and running from conversations, because a lot of the critics have this idea, notion that we don't really know our history, know our teaching, know our doctrines. Yet it's not that we don't know it. It's not that we don't understand it. It's that we have to be diligent and we have to be judicious in how we approach these conversations. And that was the whole point of this live stream, was to look at what is the nature of defending our faith, ability, and toxic apologetics, and how do we come to have rational conversations with people who are open and receptive to hear what we say. And it's not that we are being cowards. It's not that we don't understand. It's that we do understand. The issue is that you want us to understand it the way you want us to understand it, and that is to get us to deny our testimony, get us to deny the reality of our faith, and to abandon that faith. And for me, that is the most manipulative and sick thing a person can do, because I don't see myself as a victim. I don't see myself as somebody who is being brainwashed. I don't see myself who belongs to a cult. I see myself living a life that is in line with the teachings and the principles of the gospel that Christ himself laid down. And if that is the main crux of being a Christian, I stand on that. And you could take, and I'll say this, if there wasn't Joseph Smith, if there wasn't, if I live my life according to the way I understand the Bible, how to live one's life, that says more volumes than any argument and disputations, whether it's online or in person. Because it comes down at the end of the day, how are you living? It's like A.W. Tozer says in his book, The Crucified Life. It's one thing to understand and ask yourself who Christ is, but it's another thing to do something about it. And we are in a position of not understanding and knowing who Christ is. It's we know who Christ is. What are you going to do about it? What action take right now to live your life that is in line? That's why Galatians 2:20 has become my life verse. I live, I crucified unto Christ, but it's no longer that I live, it is Christ that lives through me. And that is such a powerful powerful verse for me, and that right mark of a true Christian, one who's willing to lay down his life, lay down her life, forsake all things to come to Christ and let Christ rule in our hearts and our minds so that we can be transformed, as Paul says, become living sacrifices, to be transformed by the renewing of our mind and not to be conformed to the things of this world. And so check out Jessica's channel. I do morning devotions on my other channel. We're walking through the book of Redemption's Path, recovery oriented. And yeah, be blessed. Thanks for hanging out with us. And until next time, have a great day or a great night or whatever you're watching.
Good night.